Are we live? Are we live? I didn't check if we were live in Salem. Okay, cool. Right. So, hmm, someone on the feedback form, which like 7 people across the like 60 people taking this class filled out, was like, I don't know if this is like this really feels like a cybersecurity class. Which is fair because I've taught no cybersecurity at all this term. Um, and I didn't know that. I actually thought cryptography was a subset of cybersecurity. And then I went to Ground Truth, which is csrankings.com. Um, no, CS rankings, is it?
Yeah, they are.
.org? Yeah, yes. So Carnegie Mellon's number one. A very interesting paper came out on this recently. Someone actually looked at these and was like, institutions in the United States are ranked way too highly compared to the rest of the world. Because I guess there's some conferences that are like really inflated. So um, if you're like me and you recently got a PhD and you're like, wow, every single person that speaks Chinese feels like they have 15 IQ points on me. Not like this person's like slightly smarter than me. Like they're in their second language and first year of the program and I'm about to graduate and they're better at everything than I am. You'd be like, kind of weird that the number one ranked university in China is lower ranked than the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is a no kidding school. Like Urbana-Champaign is very good, right? But you would not assume they're better than the best school in China, right? And so, anyways, some study came out that said the conference weightings across different disciplines look inaccurate because it looks way harder to get into some of these fields than others, right? And anyways, when you reweight these, of course, instantly what happens is the top 5 universities are the top 5 universities in China, which is what you should expect to happen because there are 1.3 billion people in China and 300 million people in the United States. So unless on average Americans are 5 times harder working than Chinese, we should have no universities in the top, right? And then you're like, what are you talking about? There's definitely a large number of people that grew up and perhaps got master's degrees in China before coming to Carnegie Mellon. And that was in fact true in 2016 and is not true anymore, right? And in fact, that's right around the time when they transitioned it. I was very clearly at UNC while this was happening, and I remember just every year. And it also seemed like the best students that spoke Chinese, and I can't differentiate students that were born in China or no China. Like, I just know that they spoke Chinese, right? It's weird that there's like fewer Chinese speakers in the department every year. And then by the time I was graduating, I was one of the smartest students in the department, right? So that worked really well for me. Like, yes. But that wasn't really great for the old ego when I was on archive and someone was like, CS ranking looks pretty wrong. And yes, it's because basically Anglophone conferences were overinflated. This was actually a huge scandal in another discipline, not related to China. When I was going through U Chicago, U Chicago had the number one ranked econ program in the world, still does. And someone pointed out that all of the econ rankings only ranked conferences in English. And that seemed like a little bit surprising. And then U Chicago correctly pointed out much econ research outside of countries that speak English is still published in English, right? Um, and then someone named Yanis something, the Greek, I don't know. Yeah, that person was like, yeah, we think all of the Anglophone literature is wrong and don't agree with it. And then he saved the Greek economy by himself. And so that was a bit of a reproducibility crisis for the Anglophone literature, because a short while after that, someone pointed out that if you looked at all of the non-Anglophone research right before 2008, they were like, what are you guys doing? And none of the Anglophone research said that. So anyways, so this is ground truth, except for that one problem. And I think what's going on here. So here's security. And I think here's cryptography. So this would suggest that in addition to security and cryptography, not being the same thing, which was my thesis, they're even completely different subfields. So this is claiming that security is a systems topic and cryptography is a theory topic. So I didn't know either of those two things. And so someone capable of admitting fault would say, I owe you all an apology. And instead of apologizing, I am going to put together 6 different lectures I delivered on cybersecurity across different classes I've taught historically and do all of them in 4 hours. You can stop me for questions. I successfully got through all of this in 90 minutes with the undergraduates, but like my throat was physically painful after about 55 minutes. So I'm going to push things slightly less hard here. Now, it is also possible with the undergraduates, to be clear, I do love them, right? It was probably less important that they actually understood any of this because their class isn't called cybersecurity and yours is. I called this logics. To me, the most important thing that comes out of this is linear temporal logic, but in fact, that's actually only one logic. So I guess I don't know why I called it logics. Um, but really, there's about 6 topics in here. Separately, we don't have class next week, right? We all think that. Okay, that's a relief. I've heard that maybe there are some classes next week, which is a huge. Okay, so the Monday class. Okay, so I was not going to have class on Monday, and I do teach a Monday class. I'll send some emails. Well, I'm worried. So after the Monday class should have happened, if it hasn't happened, then there's no way to not be in trouble for it having not happened, right?
I think I need to diagram this.
Oh, right. Announcements. Security topics unrelated to crypto. They're not unrelated to crypto. So the reason I can give you 6 lectures worth of content today is actually because we've looked at so many systems, I can just pull examples and not have to explain things, and it all actually makes sense. When I was designing this class and looking at the way I used to teach cybersecurity, it was like walking through molasses because we had to stop constantly and be like, wait, you know what a web server is, right? You're like, do you know what a buffer is, right? Because one of the things I always taught was a buffer overflow, and I taught people buffer overflows before I taught them what buffers are, right? Um, I looked at this stuff, and it does look like we can just cover it all quickly, and it'll all make sense now, right? This is a sort of similar thesis to how when we got to heaps, and I was like, I think I can just like teach you all of data structures in like an hour. And I think that worked. My impression is that worked. I'll look at the code quality in the next few weeks. One of the problems with looking at the code quality now is I think you're probably a little bit fried from the semester, so it's difficult to tell if I'm bad at teaching or you're tired or you're lazy, right? 'Cause let's be real, I'm lazy, so I should expect you all to be lazy, right? But anyways, I'm also going to teach you some automata theory. It's not like there's no law that says you have to know automata theory to have a CS degree, but I think there should be a law that says that. And the real reason I think there should be a law that says that is I constantly talk to people that seem confused about like what computers actually do. And to me, what a computer actually does is they take a bunch of bits and then every clock cycle they change some of the bits. And that's exactly what an automata does. So being able to think about things in terms of automata is really useful. Okay, so with that, here's the things we're learning today. I need to have a clock somewhere because I timed this quite. Threat and threat models and CIA triad are the bookends on this. These are the cybersecurity only topics. These are the types of topics I would expect someone to learn in a 2-year degree called cybersecurity at a community college, for example, right? So cybersecurity for its own sake, right? In sort of that context. And the people that learn these things, I think they tend to do things like run the or set up the routers and do network architecture at a place like Willamette University, right? So you're like, oh, we should make sure this thing's connected to that thing and not the other thing, right? And like, oh, these people need permissions, right? And so that's definitely cybersecurity. And there's theoretical ways to approach that, and there's applied ways to approach that. In between are the theoretical things. So we're going to start with trace properties. I had in Salem, and she was supposed to be here, a guest speaker named Tysa Kushner from Galois. And Galois is a what used to be a local cybersecurity firm. They seem to all have left Portland because they were essentially only contracting with the United States federal government. So a bunch of them have moved to the DMV area, which stands for DC, Maryland, Virginia. That sounds right. The speaker I had in is now at Boulder. There's like a national lab in Boulder. So she's out there. She was super cool. And unprompted, mind you, I just said, come give a talk. She was talking about trace properties. Versus me, so the trace properties I take traces of execution of a piece of physical hardware. And that's my research area. She was taking traces, so recordings, of recommendations of an artificial pancreas algorithm. So think if you have type 1 diabetes, you can get an implant that measures, I don't know how healthcare works, right? But somehow there's some algorithm inside this cybernetic implant, I guess, right? That tells you what combinations of insulin products to use. She was taking traces of this thing, and basically what her and her research group did is they looked at every single artificial pancreas and found out that none of them were giving safe recommendations, which is unsurprising because you would expect it to be very, very hard to give safe recommendations. And as a rule, like doctors and humans have never given safe recommendations, right? But we can prove for a computer that it's doing something unsafe, right? And so this can be concerning and troubling, and it is non-trivial to prevent that from happening, right? So her cybersecurity work is how can we secure the artificial pancreas, right? Very interesting idea. Crib key structures and Bushi automata are two ways of writing out state transitions, basically. So we have thought, perhaps at various points in time, this term of thinking of a Bitcoin being in a certain state, or a computer being in a certain state, or a server being in a certain state, right? The transitions between these states can sort of describe security properties. And so crib key structures and Bushi automata are two ways to think about them. Crib key structures are too simple. They're simple enough that they border on being incorrect, but they are very, very close to human intuition, so I teach them first. Then linear temporal logic is a textual way to represent the same topics. It is a very interesting form of logic. It was also featured in our guest speaker. So I didn't want to get a guest speaker and make sure I was talking sense, but I actually made all of these slides before hearing the guest speaker, and we had many overlapping topics. One of the reasons actually to, for example, go to DevOps tonight is, for example, I think if I went to DevOps, we would have heard many technologies. I've taught you this term, but you don't know until you talk to someone else, right? And think like the Python user group is like next Thursday. I'm going to go and see if they mention Lambda expressions, right? Bushi automata are a generalized form. They're a form that accommodates infinite traces. Why do we care about infinite traces? Web servers, as a rule, we do not plan on them turning off ever. We do not plan on Bitcoin ever stopping, so we care a lot about infinity. Bushi automata are a generalized form of the deterministic finite automata. The deterministic finite automata is the first automata you learn about in your automata theory class. Again, automata theory classes are not commonly taught anymore. My colleague at Amazon uses automata theory all the time to describe security policies because the security policies are sufficiently complex. The simplest way to express them is with automata. So automata are around, they're coming back, they're going to become more and more important as more and more complicated agreements happen between different people using cloud servers. LLMs are a big thing right now, and LLMs have dramatically complicated permissions because frequently you need to add now some LLM permissioning to your whatever your application is, right? And that LLM is going to be running on some other server and all of these things, right? So we're getting closer and closer to just wanting to think of things in terms of automata. My hope is that in the fullness of time, we teach automata the way we teach calculus, which is like basically everyone needs to know them, right? I don't know that that's going to happen, but that's probably starting to happen with linear algebra, and automata are getting pretty close to linear algebra. Safety and liveness is a way of differentiating the two most common classes of security properties, which are good things happening eventually and bad things never happening. And those are going to motivate the CIA triad. Basically, the CIA triad is 5 slides at the end of this class where I will explain using slightly different vocabulary words that you now know all of the context of an introductory cybersecurity class. You just happen to know a bunch of other stuff as well. So that's the sketch for tonight. I'm expecting us to hit linear temporal logic right after dinner, but we'll see what happens. If I were teaching a class that was only called cybersecurity, which again, my impression is that that is the wrong way to teach cybersecurity, right? But if I were to do that, and I have done this in the past, one of the first things I talk about is, well, what do we mean by security? I have a strong preference for saying computer security instead of cybersecurity because I think that makes more sense to me than people say, does that apply to my phone? Does that apply to the web server, right? Security, to me, is about quite literally picking winners and losers, right? So this is about privilege. This is about who has it. This is about who doesn't. As a rule, one of the things with security is it's not sort of power neutral. It seems to very strongly, as a rule, privilege the power quo because one of the things you're securing is that changes aren't made, right? And so if you prevent changes from being made with a security policy, that is strengthening existing power relations, right? The classic example of this from an undergrad course taught by my advisor that I didn't teach is Sony Music Group put some digital rights management on a variety of CDs and sort of the last days of CDs. And if you put these CDs into your computer. It would load some executable on your device that could not credibly be considered anything other than a virus, but was not legally classified as a virus because Sony was more powerful than you were, right? So they would say, we have a right to have this executable running on your device while you have our intellectual property on your device, right? And so this was a big deal in early cybersecurity because that was in fact actually technically legal. It was held up in courts, and sort of everyone that knew how computers work was so disgusted by this that they tried to boycott Sony, and then Sony released Bloodborne, and that didn't really work, right? But this idea of what is secure, it's like, well, Sony was pretty sure that if they sign an artist, that artist records an album, they distribute that album, and you put that album in your computer, that while your computer is playing that album, Sony owns the sound that is coming out of your speakers, right? And that's sort of coherent with U.S. intellectual property law, at least as far as I understand it, right? So what is secure? It's like, well, Sony secured their intellectual property. I think this sketched a lot of people out because the thought was at that time, it's like, well, if it's physically on my device that I purchased and own, that I own the hardware for, that I paid for with US dollars, right? That device should be securely controlled by me. But it was not. It was being controlled by Sony, right? And then so we say, for whom is the what secure? So is your device secure to contain Sony's intellectual property, or is it secure for you to use it? And then from whom is the what secure? So I think the thing that this executable from Sony would prevent you from doing is it attempted, and I don't know how successful it was, to make it impossible to write the sound files to another medium, because this is when people were burning like mix CDs for each other and distributing them. My understanding, I'm not like the oldest person in the universe, but I thought people used to like tape things off the radio and hand them to each other for like thousands of years, and this was never, like, the FBI never got involved in that, to my knowledge. Maybe they should have. That seems unlikely. So Sony sort of unilaterally made this decision that was held up by the courts, and many people made the decision to maybe not use Sony. I think this is ongoing. Some of my friends and I did for a while play a game called Monster Hunter Wilds that downloaded with a lot of anti-cheat stuff on it, which is like some executable that, I mean, it didn't run on my computer, but like other people had it running on their computers. And it like slows your computer down in some way or something. And it's like, don't I own this piece of art that I purchased? Like, can't I just like appreciate the art? Can't I, like, if I had a painting on my wall, I would be able to look at that painting after I paid for it without like my lights being dimmer or like my house not working as well or something, right? It was kind of an interesting intellectual idea. I guess it's sort of hard to care about that stuff in the sense that like companies are going to do whatever they want and I can't stop them, right? But it is interesting to think about when we start talking about security, right?
I think Ubisoft is arguing that you don't own your games in core right now.
It is true I don't own any Ubisoft games. There you go. Got him. I like to think that the only thing I really own is the memories of the times I've spent with my friends. I'm going to take a bite of burrito. Read this slide. Anyways, right around the time Sony was making these arguments, and apparently Ubisoft is still making them, and I don't know, like I saw Sinners in IMAX on Friday. That was incredible, right? Yeah, I guess the rights of that are going to revert to Ryan Coogler in 25 years, and it's like, that makes sense, right? Ryan Coogler made Sinners. No, probably no one else could have made that. I think Warner Brothers paid to have it made, but was Warner Brothers going to find someone else to pay to make that movie? No. So like it's kind of odd they own it, right? This seems like an odd way to do ownership. Probably the Bitcoin people think something to that effect, right? Maybe it's like odd to own other people's ideas, right? Bitcoin is open source, so the idea of how Bitcoin worked is not owned by anyone, right? But Bitcoins themselves are owned by someone, and they are quite secure. A Bitcoin is just a chain of ownership. So like by definition, it is not even a Bitcoin unless someone owns it, right? This is inseparable. The concept of ownership and Bitcoin are identical. They've been completely conflated. So there's no complexity there, right? We can't argue any way about it other than the fact that it is secure to its owner. Um, Bitcoin is also a system, so there is having a Bitcoin, and then there is the idea of there being Bitcoins that exist on the blockchain, right? And the idea of Bitcoins existing, that secures the idea of double spend. So the value of your Bitcoin is protected because you can trust that there will not be double spending because of the public ledger. So someone can check and see if you've already spent the coins you're trying to spend on them. And it is very, very difficult, but not impossible, to lie, right? So Bitcoins are secure from being double spent, and they are secure from someone other than the owner spending them. Very precise. Whenever we get into these models of who, whom, for whom, whatever, it's important to think about the limitations. And my impression is that by asking a very specific series of questions, you can often entice someone into believing a wildly insecure system is secure by picking one manner in which it seems like it might plausibly be secure and only asking questions about that. I recently did, the university wanted to talk to me about the Signal messaging app after like the defense secretary was using it, which is interesting. Does not increase my confidence Signal was not made by the United States federal government, which I was kind of wondering about, but that's neither here nor there. So the thing with Signal, and I used Signal when I was doing something that the government thought was illegal and I thought was legal. And it is very, very obvious when a phone is using Signal. Signal uses end-to-end encryption, which means if you send something that looks an awful lot like a text message in Signal, there's a lot of bits going around. And probably your phone doesn't have a cryptography accelerator on it. A few times I went to things like, we'll call them protests. So I'm at a protest, right? And I'm like responsible for like making sure some car doesn't come down a road, right? So I'm like watching a street, right? And so we're all on a Signal thread. My phone got physically hot to the touch from running Signal, right? And so maybe if I like got arrested at that time or something, it would be really, really difficult to argue in court that my phone was hot for some reason other than using Signal, the only thing that caused my phone to be hot to the touch. And of course, the only app I have on my phone, because I don't put apps on my phone, right? Maybe a little bit too obvious that my phone was definitely using Signal. Now, the messages that are being sent by Signal are totally secure, right? But, like, depending on who your lawyer is, right? Like, maybe it's like, wow, this person was standing like right at the perimeter of where a protest was. Their phone was hot to the touch and it only had the Signal app on it. Like maybe that's enough circumstantial evidence to argue I'm like an accomplice to some crime or something, right? Without knowing the content of the messages. When someone has a Bitcoin, and if they had a Bitcoin in say 2013, Bitcoin is the fake money for criminals. What were they using it for in 2013? It's inherently suspicious that someone was connected to a Bitcoin network. You don't have to know what they were doing, but you know that like the only things that Bitcoin was being used for a decade were illegal and generally regarded to be immoral, right? Like you can make up your own minds about that. And so there is absolutely nothing about Bitcoin that says like, hey, when you go to cash this thing out and turn it back into currency, no one can figure out who you are. It's like, no, you definitely had a Bitcoin. And as far as we can tell, for some sense of we, right, every single Bitcoin was involved in something that it was a felony, right? So that's kind of weird, right? Like you're not really being protected from that, right? Like the fact that you can't be attached to any transaction doesn't mean that you didn't do something sketchy, right? And so a third party can tell, given some public key, when and how much currency is being moved through that public key, right? And so I think a classic example is if you do some insider trading, for example, it's very obvious that a bunch of money moves from specific public keys to other specific keys at a specific time, right? Like you can't cover that up. And then all of those keys should be regarded as suspicious for some foreseeable amount of time, right? And then perhaps you don't necessarily even consider those public keys, but you consider those chains of ownership, because wherever those Bitcoins go, if they ever get converted back into cash at some site or something, right? Like you should really wonder, why is my webcam off? That's creepy. You should really wonder well, geez, like, I mean, wasn't this affiliated with something that was probably illegal? Like, this is inherently suspicious without knowing the individuals involved, right? So these are some limitations of Bitcoin. This is how people always get in trouble with Bitcoin. It is true that Bitcoin guarantees certain things. It guarantees non-repudiation. There is no way to fake a transaction once it happens, right? Is that enough? Is that what you really care about? Because if you actually care about a truly anonymous currency, you have to make sure you never connect to the Bitcoin network from a public network node anywhere that can ever be attached to you, right? And that's infeasible, right? And this was the thing that I spoke about it at some length. Like Snowden had to be very careful connecting to the internet to do anything, even if nothing he was doing was suspicious, because just moving large amounts of information out of Hawaii is inherently suspicious, whatever the information is, right? So the common way to think about this as a generalized solution, let me say one thing first. My impression is threat modeling doesn't work at all, but it is an industry standard. Okay, so having said that, a common way that the industry likes to approach this idea, and I think this does make them feel better, and it probably eliminates large numbers of bugs, right? Just not all of them, is we create a threat model. And what is a threat model? We go to OWASP, and I very much hoped to take us to an OWASP event this semester, which is actually why I asked for a Thursday time for the slot, because our local OWASP chapter meets on Thursdays. I think this stands for Open Web and Application Security. I don't know what the P stands for. Project? Anyways, they're application security people, and they're quite lovely. Know some of them locally. OWASP, they oftentimes use the term information security or InfoSec, right? So people that manage IT networks and are responsible for making sure that like employee payroll data doesn't get posted on the company website, right? Okay, and so they say your threat model should contain the following. It should contain a description of the subject to be modeled. For example, Bitcoin. For example, your company payroll data. For example, a traffic light. And use a traffic light radar, right? I think it is very interesting to make threat models of commercial airliners, right? In the olden days, when I taught this lecture right after spring break, I would always start with the anecdote of like when I sit on a commercial airline because of the worms that live inside of my brain, the only thing I think about the whole time is the security protocol around the lavatory that is closest to the cockpit, right? Which is just like an endlessly fascinating source of study to me, right? And at some point in my life, I noticed that roughly halfway through a 4-hour flight, we'll say, a flight attendant would take the like service cart, turn it diagonally, and block the entrance to sort of the service station, and then knock on the door of the cockpit, and a pilot would come out and be able to use the lavatory. And this was like so fascinating to me, right? Because someone wrote down a threat model and figured out their attack surface and was like, oh, we have to make sure that like no one can directly walk into the cockpit while the door is open. They invented an airlock, right? And they just did it with stuff that's already on the plane, which is like super cool. Around a year or two after I was here, there was a case of basically a rogue pilot that was like experiencing some form of mental health crisis and intentionally crashed a plane while the other pilot was not in the lavatory. I got on a plane a few weeks after that, and I noticed that the protocol had changed already, which is now a flight attendant would go into the cockpit when one of the pilots would come out. So there were always two people in the cockpit. And I was like, well, that's like an obvious solution. Maybe we should have thought of that before, right? But like we know now, right? And it's like, this is so obviously a case of someone using what I perceive to be a threat model. To my knowledge, the people that came up with threat models were application security people. They were computer scientists, right? And it's like very, very clearly being used by the airline industry, even if they don't say it, right? It's the exact same conceptual ideas. And so this includes some notion of some assumptions. So like one of the assumptions that was made prior to one of these events is that like, if there is one pilot in the cockpit, that is safe. That assumption was false, so the security policy has changed, right? Some of the potential threats to the system are a passenger, like me, walking in the cockpit, and probably it is more likely that I like press a random button by accident than I attempt to hijack a plane, right? But it's like, when I was a small, like baby human child, tiny, I was allowed in a cockpit once, and it was like under very specific instruction not to touch any buttons, even though the plane was like stationary and turned off, right? I imagine toddler Calvin could have crashed an airplane that was stationary, right? Like I believe in myself. I think I was capable of doing that, right? What are some actions that are taken to mitigate each threat, right? So like nothing makes it impossible to hijack a plane, right? We've all seen The Dark Knight Rises, and we know if Bane is on your plane, it's going to get hijacked, right? Like, none of us can stop Bane. He's smarter and better looking than all of us. He's played by Tom Hardy. Um, and so that's just something that can happen. And then besides all of this, when you take time to make a model, you should make some effort to check to see its accuracy, right? I have a strong preference for writing proofs. It is very obvious to me that most of the people that do security work do not write proofs because nothing is secure, right? So, any way of validating this is useful. It's like, hey, can we prove the consistency between these two models? Can we even just look at these two models and think they're secure? Can we come up with a few things that might be counterexamples and see they're not counterexamples? All of these things are useful things to do once you have some model. My impression is when I asked what, for whom, and from whom any limitations, this is logically equivalent to the threat modeling exercise, right? The way I define security and the way threat models are created are equivalent. There's simply strong convergence on this specific way of thinking about security. This is how I applied this notion to Bitcoin. I think of Bitcoin as being a currency. I always describe it as a decentralized cryptocurrency. But that decentralized in crypto, those are about the how and the for whom, right? Or perhaps the from whom with decentralized is secure against a central authority. But I think it's simple enough to think Bitcoin is a currency, so it is an alternative to a barter economy. So its client is some economy that requires a currency, right? And it also requires internet access and some way to generate proof of work. So it needs a certain amount of networking and a certain amount of compute power. Separately, it has a very strong assumption that compute power is evenly distributed among humans. That's false to me. That is one of the core limitations of Bitcoin, but it was less untrue in 2008 than it is now. And what are you protecting against? Bitcoin is secure from double spenders. It is secure from a central authority. And in some ways, it is secure from surveillance, right? You don't have to use your social security number as your public key, right? So there is some degree ambiguity. But the public ledger is a serious limitation. I have to take another bite of burrito. Did you all eat dinner already? Way ahead of the game. I sort of perceive threat models in 3 dimensions. There's the questions they answer, which are these ones. That's 1 dimension. There's the techniques, which is the diagram. And then there's techniques or like boxes you want to check. So you want to do sort of these 3 sets of 5 things concurrently when you're making a threat model. I don't know the best way to think about it, so I think of them in terms of dimensions. You sort of have a 5 by 5 by 5 matrix within which you're trying to check every box, right? While I am making a diagram, I am going to think about from whom, right? And so these are sort of step-by-step a procedural way to generate a threat model. How's my time? A little slow? Okay. We're going to make a diagram, and we're just going to draw out the thing that we have, right? So we're going to draw out a traffic light or a commercial airline or a blockchain or a web server. We're going to identify threats. To me, this is the inherent weak part. I think if you've written a proof, like prove there is no largest prime number, it is notoriously difficult to make negative proofs. It is notoriously difficult to say, there are no threats to this system I did not consider, right? So to me, I perceive 2 as a core weakness, and I also don't think it is a weakness to which there will ever be any amicable solution. I think security is just hard and will always be hard. It will probably always be impossible, right? In stage 3 of the threats that we think of, which are mostly going to be the historical attacks we've experienced, and maybe we'll anticipate a few attacks before they happen, but we're probably not going to be better or motivated than the people that are going to attack us, right? So we're just going to have to be prepared or conscientious or follow some policies or something like that. So we're going to say, what are we doing to defend against the threats, the known threats, right? And then at the end, you validate, and that's the same validate as sort of how. Okay, so this is my diagram. This is an example of a diagram. This is a Bitcoin. This is not a Bitcoin. This is a Bitcoin singular. This is a chain of ownership. When I look at this graph, to me, something always just jumps out at me immediately, and I don't know if this is true for anyone else. But it is so obvious how reliant this is on owner T not losing their private key. That private key has to be protected from everything. And I don't know who owner two is, and I don't trust them to not leak their private key. Like it's just, we put all of this information into making all these hashes and doing all these proof of work, and it is extremely likely owner two is going to put their public key on a USB drive and leave it at a Starbucks, right? I just think that's like a near certainty, right? And so fundamentally, Bitcoin's point of vulnerability really, to me, looks like right here, right? But there's other things going on here too as well. Who made sure owner one and owner two have different private or public keys? Did anyone check that? No, it is comically unlikely that happens, right? Um, but depending on how much probability you know, and depending on your expectation about how big keys are going to be, you might be like, actually, like every 120 years, people are going to have the same key. And that's going to be really, really chaotic when that happens. Like that could destabilize the entire blockchain, right? So maybe that's very sketchy, right? Um, and then you're probably looking at some other things like, who's making sure all these hashes are correct, right? Um, who's verifying this? Right. And so the verification is sort of baked into the notion that we've got a big decentralized network and everyone's going to verify it. And people are only going to accept some hash if they can verify it too. It's like, yeah, sure, but like what if, there's a bug in Bitcoin Core that doesn't check the lowest half of the bits or something, right? Wildly insecure instantly. It would be very difficult to perceive this. Probably some number of times this term, if you're like me, you've confused 64-bit words with bytes. And so maybe in your verification algorithm, you write down the number of words to confirm, and then you give it an 8-bit type instead of a 64-bit type, and you accidentally only verify 1/8 of the signature. Well, now it is approximately infinity times easier to falsify one of these signatures, right? And there's no reason to assume that that wasn't part of Bitcoin for years, right? And what happens if the internet goes down? All of these things live on they probably live on solid state drives. They might live on hard drives too, right? So if the internet goes down, you can't spend your coins, but you don't not have them anymore. But do you really have them if you can't spend them? I don't know. That's an interesting idea, right? So major power outages. I think one thing that Big Doomsday is always worried about is like some trawling fisher thing cuts one of the transatlantic or Pacific cables, and that instantly costs the stock market $1 trillion or something. Like, I don't know, right? Like that sounds stressful to me, so I can understand that would be something you worry about. But if I, for example, had all of my money in fake money for criminals, I would maybe be a little bit more worried about cables getting cut. But separately, like I have all my money in this thing called a Vanguard Target Retirement Day Fund. And it seems like I should have like extremely low confidence in whatever that is. My hope is that if anything happens to Vanguard, something happens to me first. That was my plan. I was like, I don't think it's secure, but I think whatever hits Vanguard will like pass its way through my body on the way to Vanguard. So I was talking to my partner about like the big one earthquake. Like if there's like a 9.0 earthquake in Portland, I'll be like, that'll be so bad. I like won't have to think about my retirement fund for like months, right? Like, like there seems like there's only upside on this, right? So like, what if you get really thirsty? It's like, well, you don't have to think about your retirement fund. So I think these things are all mitigated. 496-bit keys. We talked a little bit about how big 2 to the 4096 bits are. Probably if you add up every transaction taken in human history, you've got like several thousand digits left over that you didn't need to use, right? So you're probably very unlikely to have collisions, even with like birthday paradox and all that stuff. As a rule, we assume that there are more lucrative things to do than to have more compute power than the entire Bitcoin blockchain. So it's unlikely people are going to do proof of work attacks. And if the internet goes down temporarily, you don't lose your fake money for criminals. It has to go down forever. And if the internet goes down forever, that's just another good thing, right? So it's like you either have your Bitcoins or you don't have the internet. That's all W's. Now we're going to introduce validation, and I'm going to introduce validation with the notion of an attack game. I'm going to use the attack game on digital signatures. To me, the most, I don't know, kind of the coolest and funnest thing we did this term was, we just covered it kind of quickly, but the digital signatures on transactions, because it used SHA and RSA, and it didn't use them in a conventional way, so I thought that was really cool. So I've pulled some text out of CryptoBook, and I'm going to let you read this while I take another bite of burrito. I should be sponsored. I'm live streaming and talking about burrito, and I'm not saying the brand of burrito. If anyone's listening, so I could be approached for a sponsorship deal. This could be any kind of burrito. The camera's not on. One of the things that's kind of interesting to me about what I'll call computer security, maybe cryptography. I don't know what to call things, right? Um, they're all finite bit strings, which means that at some point there's just some probability someone just guesses the secret. Right? That can just always happen, right? So every notion of security we have has baked in some notion of probability, where it's comically unlikely that the bad thing happens, whatever the bad thing is, right? Um, CryptoBook does this interesting idea I haven't seen before, where they use this notion of, they call it the attack game, which is, you say, um, signatures are designed to resist this specific form of attack. Here is the probability they resist this specific form of attack. We are looking at numbers, so we can now write mathematical proofs about the bounds of our probability distribution, right? That's an interesting formulation, but they call them these attack games. How's this work? Okay, so we're going to take the notion of signature security. A signature scheme or an algorithm or something is a tuple, so it is an ordered triple. Script G, script S, script V, which stands for generate, sign, and verify. I wrote something called keygen, right? And then I wrote something called like RSA or whatever, RSA and C, right? That did both sign and verify. It is defined over big M. Why am I saying big M? Because that's a capital script M. That's a set. That's a set of messages. Messages are bit strings. I've shown you, I hope convincingly, this term that I can turn anything you want into a bit string, right? The next thing is sigma, big sigma. We often use big sigma in computing to say sets of things related to a language or like an output of an automata. Sigma is going to come up a bit later. That's also a bit string. Those are also bit strings. Big M, I think of this as, those are the ciphertexts and those are the digests. When I release a signed message, I release the ciphertext from the digest and I sign it with my key, right? So I have messages and signatures. All of this is relative. So if I'm the person generating the signatures, I'm the challenger, right? Relative to some adversary. And the adversary is engaging in what we saw in the previous slide. Oops. Oh, how did I open Copilot? I think Microsoft thinks they own my physical device. That's my impression. Chosen message attack. So what's the adversary going to try and do? Well, I'm wheeling and dealing, right? I'm sending out signed messages. Like I'm passing secret notes in class. Maybe I'm selling state secrets to my geopolitical adversaries. Maybe I'm saying nice things about one of my cats, but not both of my cats at the same time. And I don't want the other cat to know what I'm saying, right? Because you can only praise your cats concurrently or with outside of earshot of another one. And so I've got all these secrets I'm passing around. And so maybe evil Calvin, maybe evil Calvin is sitting just outside of my room, listening to every single secret I distribute, right? And evil Calvin is the adversary, and I am the challenger. So I'm the challenger. I generate my public and private key, right? And the public key is getting distributed everywhere, so the adversary can see it, right? I put it on the blockchain or wherever, right? So everyone sees my public key. And then what do I start doing? Well, I start sharing my secrets. Maybe my adversary is pretending to be my friend. Maybe my adversary is very successfully impersonating one of my two cats. And for example, that cat might keep saying meow. And when your cat says meow, you have to ask back, this is the law. Are you a little baby? And then if she meows, then she's a little baby, and if not, then she's an adult, right? So if she doesn't meow, she has to start paying rent, right? So they always meow back, right? Um, so perhaps we go through this transaction I times, right? And each one of these I times, there's some corresponding message and some corresponding digest. And evil Calvin was listening to this the whole time. And finally, after some point in time, evil Calvin thinks, I've got to hang for this. I highly suspect Calvin's 4096 bits are 110110, and you have some guess from some probability distribution. So you do the only logical thing. You take some message you want to say, which is probably something that's like, I love you, cat, but you're not my favorite cat, which I would never say, right? Every cat is my favorite cat. I only have favorites. Same as students, in case you're wondering. Okay. I one time I told the undergraduates that I wasn't sure they were smarter than one of my cats, and they didn't really like that. And saying like you're kidding afterwards, it's like it's too late, right? But they did do really poorly on a midterm, right? And so it felt reasonable to me at the time. But I have stopped comparing my students' intelligence to my cats, just so you know that. So you're all safe. Huh? I think that really I've just put everyone in the same bin of they're all being my favorites. Everyone's my favorite. We all bring different strengths. Like we've got a strengths matrix. So like my cats are good at being little babies. The undergrads are good at being silly little geese. And the grads are good at being stellar and upstanding humans who are going to contribute a lot to society. And they're also hardworking. And generally speaking, they dress well. Okay, so A's been listening to me for a while. And then eventually says, I love you, but you're not my favorite. And encodes this with what they think the key is going to be. And creates what they think the digest is going to be. And then they distribute this signature, right? So, at some point in time, A is able to output a candidate forgery pair, which is a message and a digest that is part of the set of messages across the set of digest. Wait, is that a Cartesian product? A Cartesian product in cybersecurity? Oh my goodness, I sure hope someone in your cybersecurity class taught you Cartesian products, set membership, and ordered pairs. So, because that'd be a huge problem if that weren't true. Okay. And what do we say? We say the adversary wins the game if the following two conditions hold. I omitted what the second condition was because it looked trivial to me, so I just took it out. You can check CryptoBook. And it's basically the probability that when someone checks this, the signature is valid, right? Of course, you can check it yourself and see if the signature is valid, right? So you can just keep trying until you get one, right? You can fiddle with some of the bits. You can say, you're my favorite, comma. You can say, you're my favorite, ... right? And so you can change all of these things around and fiddle with it a bit until you perhaps get lucky, right? And so that's how I think of an attack game. And in the context of these attack games and ways of validating, right? These are the techniques that I encourage people to keep in mind. So we have dimension one, which we'll perhaps think of vertical, which is what, for whom, from whom, any limitations, how. And you've got the other dimension. We've got diagram. The last one's validate. I don't remember what all of them are. And then we've got this last dimension, and these are the things OWASP flips as like, keep in mind, right? So I'm just going to step through some of these examples. But basically, scope it out. Basically say diagram again, which I found surprising. Visually model the attack possibilities. When you go to like workshops with this, and I've been to a few of them, I always like want to like write things on a board and then like change the color of marker and like draw different arrows. And I guess that's a helpful way some people think about this. I don't really personally think about it that way, but like you can imagine yourself drawing arrows in a different color, right? You identify the threats and then you document things. Documenting things is very important. The number one documentation of vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the world, to my mind, is Mitra. Don't know what that stands for. They were sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security until last week, and now they're out of money, so I don't know how long this site will stay up. But this is a pretty interesting website, and it's basically like every bug that's ever been found and documented is supposed to be on Mint. And one of my co-researchers, actually at UCSD, if anyone's familiar with that school, um, just got their first hardware common weakness on Metro, which was pretty exciting. I was not involved at all, but I still felt a sense of pride, right? Um, very America centric, um, which you see from the fact that it's sponsored by the United States federal government. Right. So, anyways, this is one way to document things. Oh, wow, I have some interesting tabs open. Okay, so scope. Um, I realized at some point in time that the reason I was being encouraged to teach a cybersecurity class was that my manager was Jameson Watts, who had left the business school like 45 seconds before speaking to me. And the business school really has this interesting idea that they think there should be some class called cybersecurity at Willamette. And apparently none of them are teaching it for some reason. They thought I should. I was like, that's interesting. None of them like asked me if I knew what cybersecurity was before doing this, which is that would have been like my first step. And I was like, yeah, I know what cybersecurity is. And they're like, not like that. But anyways, I think of stakeholders as like the most business major term that has ever business majored, right? I've hung out a few times in like nonprofit space, and it's like when people start talking about stakeholders, it's like when that nonprofit got too much money, right? But anyways, stakeholders is one of these terms that comes up, and it is a useful term, right? So I design my curriculum, and my stakeholders are my students, right? Like that's a good thing to keep in mind, right? But who uses the service, who provides the service, who benefits from the service, and who does not benefit from the service. This is very simple with Bitcoin. Bitcoin service is provided by Bitcoin nodes. It is used by Bitcoin nodes. Bitcoin nodes benefit from the service, and who does not benefit from the service is clean air, clean water, everyone that doesn't do cybercrime, everyone that has actual material assets, and like pandas, right? So it's just like everyone except the Bitcoin nodes, right? Sony Music Group, their devices, right? Who uses the service? People that listen to music. Who provides the service? Sony. Who benefits from the service? Sony. Who does not benefit from the service? The people that listen to the music, right? So I a lot of times find this quite easy. One of my impressions is when this comes up, a lot of times the person that brings it up is not someone I would consider a stakeholder and wants to be classified as a stakeholder and make demands. So that's always something I have a notice of as well. We have a new CIO at Willamette University who wants to change our enrollment management system, but this person does not work with students. And so that was very interesting to me. It's like, it seems like you have classified yourself as a stakeholder in the student record system, and that is surprising to me, right? And so that has been politically complicated as sort of a C-suite level executive is interacting with the registrar's office who like make sure people graduate on time, right? These are interesting things that happen in corporations of all sizes. Sorry, what? I don't know. Oh, no, I don't think so. No, I did not mean to say that, so I may have misspoken. Perhaps the shareholders are the people that are nuts, right? Um, Something else I also like to keep in mind about scope. Um, Ask who's asking. Many people think they are stakeholders. And so the decision of who gets to decide who stakeholders are is itself non-trivial, right? And if you need help for technical reasons, you also have to think about who you're asking for help. This is code you've seen already. This is the blockchain. But this is an example of gaining a visual understanding of something. I suspected it would be difficult to understand what a Merkle tree looks like in program memory without making this graphic. I don't know if that's true, right? I basically made it for myself and then showed it to you. If I taught this class again and regenerated these graphics, I would actually build out the Merkle tree in the other direction. I don't think it matters. They're mathematically identical operations. We're just putting hashes in memory. What are some threats? Well, with the benefit of this, we can visually identify visual threats. So What if someone changes GC2 to GC3? Okay, so what is that? We have GC2, it's our first transaction. This is my good friend Galvin, who's transferring to Calvin 2 Bitcoins, right? But what if Calvin changed that 2 to a 3? We know what happens. The hashes blow up. You can't validate the coin. No one accepts the transactions. No one progresses that block. The transaction doesn't go through. It's null and void. It is as if it never happened. It is virtually impossible to change. What if Galvin, in the next block, submits a transaction paying themselves 2 coins, right? They want those coins back. Well, that's totally allowed if Galvin still has 2 coins left, right? And if Galvin doesn't have 2 coins left, then that's a double spend, and that gets blocked. No one will accept the transactions. It's as if it never happened, right? What happens if Galvin loses their private key? They also lose their Bitcoins, right? So that's just 2 good things, right? You don't have to remember something, and you no longer have fake money for criminals, okay? Here's some examples of some documents. I do think relatively highly of the Bitcoin paper. I think it's fairly well read. It's pretty weird to write out a probability simulation in the C programming language, but I do love the C programming language, so kind of got me there, right? I'm trying to decide what the sort of like pseudo capstone project for the systems class is next term, and I think I'm just going to implement an LLM. Like, how hard can it be, right? Is that cooler than Bitcoin? Oh, okay. What? So, is Bitcoin cool? No? What is cooler than Bitcoin?
Almost everything.
Are LLMs cooler than Bitcoin?
They're one of the few things that's not.
You see my problem here, right? Because I was like, ooh, I bet compilers are cool. I don't think anyone else thinks compilers are. You think compilers are cooler than Bitcoin?
It's a little harder. Popular.
What's the coolest thing you can implement as a demo project in 1 semester? Because I was pretty sure it was Bitcoin. I mean, the Bitcoin itself isn't cool, but all of the components are cool, right? The digital signatures are like one of the coolest things there is, right? Yeah, right? Okay. So I think we all agreed that Bitcoin is cool. You can get a Bitcoin if you want. 2010. What was going on in 2010? I don't know.
Date was still a thing.
Dig?
2 Gs.
Cool. I think traffic lights were a thing in 2010. I think we can all agree on traffic lights, right? They're cool. They're colorful. Okay, all right. So let's make a diagram. No, we're not. We don't make a diagram. Okay, I think we'll come back to it. So today we finished threat and threat models. Oh, I'm gonna start talking faster later. Okay. Trace properties. I think of security in terms of trace properties. This is the only way I think of security. There is no competing model for me. A property or a trace is a sequence of factual statements about a system at a certain point in time, and you put them in order, right? This is a good way to model non-trivial systems that do things over time. So far, every computer has traveled forward in time. Have I told you about my theory about electrons in this class? Okay, so I think, and the physical scientists hate this, right? I think there's only one electron, and that's why all of the electrons look the same. But the electron is so light it can go forward and backward in time, right? So like in my body right now, there's only one electron, but it's not the same age, right? Because there's a bunch of different electrons. And then you can make this much worse, right? The physical science people hate this even more. I think it's positively charged when it's going one direction through time and negatively charged when going the other direction through time. And there's only one charged particle in the entire universe, right? And so like all of the protons that form the atoms and like all of my molecules and all my cells and stuff, right? The protons just have the particle that's going a different way through time and carries a charge than the electrons in their electron cloud that's going the other way through time. And you're like, But Calvin, what if like not all the charges even out at any given time? That's no problem, right? I can just fiddle around with like how long it's in any given time span, right? And this is why two electrons can't occupy the same space, right? Because there's only one electron, right? So they have to be in different spaces at the same time because they're at the same time in different spaces, right? So, um, anyways, I am 100% sure that's true. I am unwilling to change my mind about it. No one that understands particle physics has been able to get through to me. And so I've always wanted to be a conspiracy theorist about something, and I think I've really found my home, the single electron theory. So electrons have the property of there only being one of them, right? And at all points in time, there's only one electron. Well, okay, that's not true. At all points in time, there's multiple electrons, but it's all the same electron. But it has different ages. Okay. I think of computer systems. Computer systems, I often think of the time points as lines of code. That's a little bit vulgar, right? Not every line of code executes in the same amount of time. And then I think of the state of the system, how I describe the system as all of the values on the stack and heap, right? So at every point in time, there are some stack and heap values. That's how I think of them, right? And I can give some property over the stack and heap. So one property I can say is there's the memory safety property, which is that anything that is on the heap has a pointer on the stack. That's the memory safety property. So, right. Trace properties. A trace property is a set of traces. A system has, or the property holds for, so a system has some property if every trace generated by the system is in the set of traces. So a system generates some set of traces, a property contains some set of traces. If the generated traces are a subset of the property traces, then the system has the property. Okay, what is a trace? Trace is a sequence of states. What is a state? A state is a description of a system. I always think of the states as a bit string because you can always think of computer memory as being a bit string, right? Over time, the bit strings change. That's it. That's all there is to it. Let's think of a traffic light. I got some questions about, is the traffic light model too simple? And I don't know. I sought out traffic lights as the absolute simplest system I've ever thought of that I think has a security property. They only have 3 states if you don't consider turn signals, or turn lights? Arrows? I don't know what traffic lights are called. I'm only going to refer to their coloration. And so I really wanted a comically simple example. And then the problem is like you can't necessarily exercise all of the interesting bits of the device with a more complex example. And then you write like the absolute simplest C program you've ever written in your life. And it has like several 100,000 states, right? There's just no way around it. So I have never really solved that problem. I used commercial airliner for a few years, and that was really just causing people's heads to explode because they started trying to do things like decide whether it mattered which flight attendant is in a certain location, right? And it's just like that's just like not a useful thing to think about, right? So I'm carrying through with traffic light. I really liked using traffic light for the graph theory and the transitive closures. I just think it's a good example. So it is what it is. The states of a traffic light are red, yellow, green. There is some sequence that they can occur in and some sequences they can't occur in. I claim they implement a security policy. Here's the thing that I think a traffic light prevents from happening. I think a sharp, hard, or instantaneous transition from green to red is unsafe because that doesn't give drivers time to stop. So either a driver slams on the brake and gets rear-ended, or a driver passes through an intersection that is a live intersection in the other direction. And in either case, you have a collision, the collision being the bad thing you're trying to happen. So I think traffic lights implement the no red without previous yellow security property in some way, right? And do traffic lights change over time? Yes. I have argued before that if a light never becomes green, that is also a pretty serious security problem because I don't think anyone will wait at a red light for 5 minutes. I think they will run the light, which is just as unsafe, right? Because the whole thing we're trying to prevent is people going through a light that is red, basically. So traffic lights change over time, or they're supposed to, right? I'm going to think of traffic lights as a state machine. State machines are named after the great state of Oregon. And machines are named after I don't have anything for that one. Okay, I'll keep working on it. Okay. A state machine is a mathematical model of computation. It is an abstract machine. So it is a conceptual machine. It's a machine that we think of. Oftentimes we'll refer to the states of a state machine as what you are thinking about at the time, right? Because it is the state of a computer is what is the computer is thinking at that time. It can be in exactly one of a finite number of states at a given time. Okay, that's interesting, and that's important, right? So my computer memory can store many different values, but it can only store one possible value at a time, right? It doesn't have ambiguous bits that can be read in multiple ways. Right? These things are often called FSM for finite state machine. And the reason for that is if they have infinite states, they are very mathematically different. Having infinite memory allows you to do things you can't do otherwise. Now, I'm going to introduce this model a little bit. I'm going to think of this in the following way. I am an observer, and I can see one of the sort of like heads or whatever they're called of a stoplight. I'm going to observe that stoplight, and I'm going to write down what I see. And what I write down is going to be the trace. So I'm going to write it down. I'm going to get some trace. Oh no, my timer turned off. Okay, I'll look at my watch. And so I'm going to ask you a series of questions about traces, but think of the trace as I observe a traffic light for some amount of time. I write down the order I see the colors come up, and then I move on at some point in time, right? So this terminates when I stop looking at the traffic light if I blink for too long or something, right? So here's an example of a trace. Perhaps I go out to some traffic light nearby, right? And I look, and when I first see it, I see red, so I write down red. And then after red, it becomes green, and so on. It proceeds red, green, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, green, yellow, right? And so I look at this and I can come to some conclusion over whether this satisfies the traffic light property based on what the traffic light property is. Now, we're not thinking too much about the traffic light property yet, because that would be a set that contains this trace, right? So we're just thinking about traces for now. So we're going to look at a few examples of some traces. Before going any further, don't get too attached to any particular form of notation here. Here's an alternative form of notation. This is expressing a traffic light trace as a string. Finite state machines are often described as reading strings, not traces. It makes no real difference, right? A string, a trace is the same thing. There's some way we communicate information at a certain point in time, information at the next point in time, and so on. So if I had an alphabet with enough letters, I would simply express my computer internal state using those letters. Right? So here's just a quick lambda expression to convert the other thing into RTY, RTY. So I am studying a traffic light. I am attempting to determine if it satisfies the traffic light property. And so I'm going to ask you now, when I first start looking at the traffic light, does the starting state matter for me to come to a conclusion over whether the traffic light is safe or not? I'm seeing a head shaking now. That's my perception as well, right? So the unsafe thing a traffic light can do is it's not that it can be a certain color. Now, I do think it is the case that if I come up to a traffic light and I see that it is blue, that would mean that it is somehow not safe, right? So to a certain point, the starting state does and doesn't matter. But if the starting state is one of the three allowable states, yellow, green, or red, it is insufficient to conclude that that light is behaving unsafely, right? And so then I ask the next thing. At some point, I'm going to stop looking at this traffic light. And when I do, the last color I will have seen has been, for example, the terminating state or the ending state or the final state. Does this matter to determine if the traffic light is safe? No, it does not, right? So whatever my model of finite state machine is, I'm going to need to conceptualize it in some way that it doesn't matter what the first or last thing I see is, right? There's something else that's going to have to matter, right? Well, is one of those things length? The longer or shorter I look at a traffic light, does that determine whether it's safe? So if I only look at it for 1 nanosecond and I only see yellow, well, that's insufficient to determine if it's safe or unsafe, right? If I see it transition from yellow to red and don't wait around to see if it ever becomes green, that's fine. I do probably want to assume it will become green someday, but it doesn't have to become green in any finite amount of time. And so my claim is that length or size, I never know how we want to refer to one of these arrays, right? My impression is that this does not matter as well. So I'm going to need some way of looking at things that doesn't matter how they start or end, and doesn't matter how long they are, but there are things that matter. The number of unique states matter. Do I need to see all of the colors? To me, this is another yes and no thing. I need to make sure I don't see any blue the whole time, right? Are any of those colors combinations of blue? Someone was trying to convince me that green was made out of blue and yellow in Salem. That's not true, right? If I mix blue and yellow together, I get brown. Those are complementary colors. No? Okay. I'm going to work in color theory next year, I think.
It's like you can
Yeah. There's the additive and subtractive primary colors, and I don't remember which is which. But I know yellow is a primary color, but its co-primary colors are cyan and magenta, which would suggest I have to mix yellow with magenta to get blue? No, probably cyan, right? Cyan is bluish. Guess we'll never know. Okay. It's unfortunate that this is beyond human knowledge, but we have no way to test these things. Does order matter? I kind of think yeah a lot, right? I think if I'm looking at a light and it's green and it becomes red, I say, huh, that's interesting. And then I think I hear like some squealing and some screeching and like probably people using like words I'm not allowed to say in class at each other, right? And then they look up and be like, oh no, it's the computer scientist that screwed everything up, not us. So a set of traces is a trace property. These terms are equivalent. So when I say property and when I say set of traces, I'm thinking of the same thing. When I say trace and I say string, I'm thinking of the same thing. I've modeled it here as a list, but really it should be. I'm going to say a system satisfies a property if all of its produced traces are within the trace property. I am not required to have a finite number of traces in my trace property in this context. In some automata theory classes, they do restrict you to finite. No one's created a computer that lasts forever yet, but there are computers that have been turned on and not yet turned off, right? So it is ambiguous whether the computers run forever or not. And we will find out in infinity years, right? So we'll never know, right? Also, the traces you produce from some system, they can satisfy more than one property, right? And this is easy to imagine, right? So we could have the property traffic light property n starts red. And that is a strict subset of traffic light property, but we don't care what it starts. But if I happen to only ever start looking at traffic lights while they're red, which I notice when I'm driving, every traffic light I see is red. So this is unsurprising to me, right? Then I'll never know which one of those two properties I'm experiencing. Right? So these properties provide a way to answer the how. We are able to define our security property using trace properties. There are some limitations here. But before we get to the limitations, I'm going to show you one graphic. And it's basically going to be the abstract syntax tree of this sentence. So I'm essentially going to parse this sentence. This is how I think of traces and properties. A property is a set of traces, so it is an unordered collection of sequences of states. The sequences of states are ordered collections of a description of a system. I don't know if that's clear or not. Fortunately, I have an example. We can have, for example, the property right? Which is unordered. So this is logically equivalent to which is the exact same property. It contains the trace maybe I should have given myself like one vowel. I think I could get through this with one vowel. Have you seen like the Oreo person on TikTok? Oh yeah, okay, anyways. Someday I will be that cool. No, that's not true. I wish that I were that cool. So is a sequence of the states red and green, and I omitted yellow. So that's what the properties are. And my claim is that having the notion of trace properties alone is insufficient. Because it's really annoying to write down every single possible trace you can see that is a legal definition of a traffic light. It's pretty easy to write down all of them of length 3, but even that is quite tedious. And you can imagine, as computer scientists, as you think about this, you're like, Wait, can't I write a script that does that? And yes, you can. If you can write a script that does it, you can probably write a something else that does it, right? And so, rather than enumerate, it is better to specify. And so we're going to get to the point of logics of specification pretty soon. But instead of writing down every possible trace, we just say the traffic light property is the set of all sequences over precisely the states red, yellow, green. Nope, I did that backwards. Green, yellow, red. I looked at this, put my mouse over it, and said red. That's how I'm doing. How are you all doing tonight? You have class on Monday? Do you have class on Tuesday? Okay, see, Salem undergrads are trying to convince me they have class on Tuesday, and I think they want me to drive down there and watch Nosferatu 1922 with them and buy them pizza.
Good.
I think they're trying to trick me. They want to watch Nosferatu. Okay. The only state seceding green is yellow. The only state seceding yellow is red. The only state seceding red is green. This is maybe unnecessarily restrictive. I think, for example, a traffic light is probably still state if it goes green, yellow, green. That would just be weird, but it would not be unsafe. Perhaps you argue that's so weird it would freak people out and they'd do something unsafe, but I don't know. I drove up here from Salem and people stop at green lights in that town all the time. I don't know why. And it's like annoying, and I don't know why they do it, but like there's no collisions. There can't be because the cars are stationary. But yeah, I definitely walked up to a stoplight today, and the light changed color, and there was two lanes of cars, and neither one of them started driving. And I was like, should I walk across the crosswalk in front of them? Like, have they not noticed? Anyways, I never got to the bottom of it. Kripke structures. Wouldn't it be cool if we could create some mathematical object that generated all these traces for us so we don't have to do it ourselves? Perhaps we could call it a Kripke structure. I had one philosopher in class this afternoon who apparently Kripke is like some known philosopher or something. A lot of this stuff actually comes out of linguistics. I think linguistics is older than computer science. And so a lot of the things that work and are secure and rigorous come from other fields because the move fast break things team has sort of been pushing the envelope in computer science for a while. And so every time we have to get it to work, we usually have to go to a different research field. So I think this is all linguistics I'm teaching you today, which is cool. So a Kripke structure models a state machine. It is not a state machine. It is a way to understand or write down a state machine. A state machine is abstract. It is a style of thinking, right? But this is one way to specify it. All right, before I proceed, I have two notes. Again, I want to reiterate the state machines can be exactly one state at a time. I have avoided, to the best of my ability, avoiding saying the words determinism or non-determinism, because then someone always asks me about quantum computers, and then I have to say I don't know anything about quantum computers, right? I'm regarding these as deterministic state machines. If they can be in more than one state at a time, we usually think of them as quantum or non-deterministic. And as a security researcher that has to make sure things actually work, I don't think about non-determinism very often, right? So I just don't perceive that. It's not part of my perception. It's not important to me. So all this stuff is deterministic, and that means it's in one state at a time. On these following slides, these are lifted, I mentioned, from another class I've taught, and that class used a slightly different typesetting style. And so all of the formal mathematics on the next like 20 slides are expressed in HTML instead of LaTeX. I didn't change it over because I was worried I would introduce so many typos it would become incomprehensible. So in the fullness of time, I hope to translate this, but it is not translated yet. Here are two examples of things to look at. This is an italicized S, but not a script S. And this is a tuple that is in a curly bracket instead of a standard paren. So those are two typesetting differences. These differences aren't meaningful or logical. They just are incidental. They simply happen this way. So I'm going to introduce a Kripke structure by describing a tuple. It is going to be not an ordered pair, but an ordered something of size more than pair. And I've taught you how to construct these, so you can make them completely out of sets if you need to. So it's going to be a set of sets that models a state machine. They're going to look an awful lot like graphs, but they're not quite going to be graphs. So there's going to be some sort of graph techniques we can think of for them. So S is a finite set of states. So the first thing in the state machine is the set of states. Easy. You're allowed to think about having infinite states as long as you don't actually use these, right? Let's look at two examples. For a traffic light, the finite set of states is green, yellow, red. And for a Bitcoin, it is the current owner. What this means is that the set of possible states for a Bitcoin is every possible owner, which means it is every possible public key. That is a large number of states, but it is a finite number of states, right? So we haven't broken any rules yet. In addition to the all possible finite states, there is I. This is the set of initial states. Sometimes it does matter what the first thing we see is. It doesn't matter with traffic lights, but it does matter with Bitcoin. I is a subset of S. This should be non-strict subset. This is just a typesetting deviation as well. I was using this as non-strict subset. When I taught this to another population, I didn't get into strict versus non-strict subset because I thought it was unnecessarily complicated, but I is allowed to be equal to S. That is completely fine. Any state in I must be a state in S. There are allowed to be states in S that are not in I, but there are not required to be. And these are the possible places that you can begin your trace. What is an example of this? Well, let's think about decimal numbers. As a rule, we do not zero prefix our decimal numbers, but they may have zeros in them. You could argue that if they have their non-whole numbers, you might have 0 dot, right? So perhaps 0 dot is an allowable prefix, but 0 anything else is not, something like that. Personally, whenever I'm specifying a numerical value, I also always specify that it has an infinite number of preceding zeros. And some people find this annoying because all of my numbers take infinite storage space. But that's not my fault. I wanted to use the integers modulo 2 to the 4096 for everything, and no one would agree with me. And then I was also going to use base 85 encoding, which was much shorter. Okay. A Kripke structure is a tuple, Si, that models a state machine. So for a traffic light, the initial states are the same as the finite states, green, yellow, red. For Bitcoin, it's a bit different. For the Bitcoin, the initial owner of every coin is Satoshi Nakamoto. So they have a required mandatory initial state. I thought that was a fun example, right? If the beginning of your chain is not Satoshi Nakamoto, you should be very, very concerned about whether it's a Bitcoin or not. It's probably something else, right? Maybe it's something that looks a lot like a Bitcoin, but was actually originally owned by Evil Calvin, okay? So we have finite set of states, and then we have a potentially smaller finite set of states. The next thing we add is R. R is the transition relation. What is that? Wait, no, hold on. Does that say R is a subset of the Cartesian product? Oh my gosh. Is R a homogeneous binary relation? That's... So a student in class in Salem today had the audacity to ask what a homogeneous binary relation was. And I pulled up the slides from last time. The student was like, oh, I wasn't here that day, which is just, that's like the hardest anyone has ever been out, I think. So I just wanted to let you know that happened. I might have the recording of it, but I'm worried it didn't pick up the student's voice because like me saying, and I always say homogeneous binary relation by accident, right? Which, because I don't know why I can't do that. But I've also started saying, binary homogeneous relation, which I can get that one right every time. But anyways, what is this? Well, we take all the states, all the finite set of states, so just red, green, yellow, or in Bitcoin, all the possible owners, right? We compare the two of them, and some of them can transition between each other and some of them can't. Now, once again, this should be non-strict subset. Why is that? Well, because any possible public key can transfer a Bitcoin to any other possible public key. So for Bitcoin, that is the literal Cartesian product. The Cartesian product is the relation. This is a case where we use that. And for traffic lights, it is much more standard, right? So these are the same as graphics. I want to introduce one terminology or one term. I've never seen this in any other context, but I thought it was interesting. R is left total. Well, that's interesting. What's that mean? That means every single state can get to at least one other state. I expressed this using the ordered pair notation, which is that For all states, they are the first element of an ordered pair in the relation. There's a variety of ways to specify this. Why do we say left total? Well, the first state is on the left side, right? And I should point out at this time another typesetting error. Notice all of my subscripts have been promoted to standard scripts, right? So if you ever see a numerical value immediately succeeding an alphabetical value, those are supposed to be subscript. And I'll try and point out these minor deviations. I had a really hard time getting some of my subscripts to render on these slides this week, and I ran out of time trying to fix it. Okay, a crypt key structure is a tuple, SIR. Ellipses, oh, there's something else. And by the way, this is the Unicode ellipses character. That's a single character. That's not 3 dots. I just want to point out that I'm using Unicode. And do you want to cheer for Unicode, or is that not the... We don't want to cheer for Unicode? Okay, we got like a little woo. Okay. Letting out a little woo for Unicode. So that models a state machine. For traffic light, R is green, yellow, yellow, red, red, green. For Bitcoin, it's the Cartesian product. Okay. S, finite set of states. I, non-strict subset of S. R, non-strict subset of the Cartesian product, right? It's probably looking an awful lot like these state machines are really heavily based on states, right? Maybe that's why they're called state machines, right? This is just a bunch of ways we manipulate states, right? Okay. Got one other thing. Got the labels. I glossed over this when introducing graphs. It is very common when you introduce graphs to say they're not just edges and vertices, but there's labeling functions on either the edges or the vertices, right? Why is that? Well, frequently we want to be able to refer to these nodes in some way, and like maybe it's weird to do that by index. Remember, the edges and vertices of a graph are in sets, so there's no way to refer to individual elements without providing indexing in the context of a proof, right? So very, very odd. Very nice to have a labeling function. In this case, the labels matter a whole lot. The labels are load-bearing with respect to the compute operations that can be performed by a crypt key structure. And the way they're going to work is they're going to work through this labeling operation. So we're going to take S, and we're going to map S into something. And what are we going to map S into? Well, we're going to introduce the notion of atomic propositions. I've talked a lot about security properties and properties as being sets of traces. It's a set of traces, and it's the set of traces of states, right? But there's other ways to think about this, and one of the ways to do this is atomic propositions. So what is an atomic proposition? An atomic proposition is a description, or it is a logical statement, or it is a function over the state at some given time. So I take my atomic proposition, I give it the current state of the system, and it returns true or false. That's what it means to be atomic. It's indivisible, so you only look at the current time point. It is not affected by earlier or later time points. And it is a proposition, which means that it is either true or false, right? So we take our atomic proposition, it maps the state into true, false, okay? We can have many possible atomic propositions. We can have many ways of describing states. And so the way we describe this is we have a set of atomic propositions, and we map S to a bit string describing the true, false value of each one of these atomic propositions. That's probably kind of weird, right? But these things are not mutually exclusive. Every possible way I can describe the state machine that I care about, I express as an atomic proposition. Now, my typesetting broke on the next slide, and this is the last time I'm going to see 2 raised to the power AP. So I'm going to mention this, and it is important to me. This is a bit string. The bit string describes the true, false value of each atomic proposition. The atomic propositions have some index. They are ordered, right? And that's kind of like all that really matters about them. I gave the example, I think, of current privilege level in a operating system, which is, for example, Windows running on AMD64. And so 2AP is that the atomic propositions are supervisor bit, and then there's like some other bit, and that gives you a total of 4 privilege levels, right? So these things really are bit strings. They're just, you can think of them as flags describing the style of computation you have or something like that. Here is the broken text. I just can't get this to work reliably. I will be good at Quarto someday. Wait, is it dinner time? Do you need to eat dinner? They're all eating dinner. Okay. You all go eat dinner. Oh, we are fine on time. Oh, we're totally chilling. So, yep, go eat dinner. I'll see you in half hour. Um, Having fun yet? This is mandatory fun today. I think I forgot to say that at the start of class. Okay. Mandatory fun.
back to the
Yeah. I also like had no idea what time it was. And wait, what's going on here? Did I close the slides? No. Oh, I think I closed the slides. Okay, let's see. Stream's back on. Video's back on. Oh, sorry. What's up, YouTube? Okay. At 3 concurrent viewers, I will review my stream key.
This is
I think so. Yeah, it looks like it's not, right? Oh, yes, yes, the display capture is not on. That would do it. Uh oh, there's 3 concurrent viewers. I have to reveal my stream key. Okay. Um, so apparently I closed the slides by accident. That's okay. This is a partial link.
so we found out that the logic's link goes into the middle of the slideshow.
Yeah? Why would it not? Like, where'd you think it was gonna go?
To the beginning.
Why would it go to the beginning? It's in the middle. Where were we? We're here. Okay. 2 AP. Okay. What is it? This is a graph. It's a graph where a subset of the nodes are initial nodes, and every node has some description. That's it. There's a few ways to view AP. We're gonna do a little bit of color theory. I don't know if this color theory is correct. Bunch of cyan, magenta, yellow truthers got all up in my grill in Salem, but I fought them off using the skills I've refined over the years as a capital G gamer. And at long last, they did in fact confess that OXFFF00 is yellow, which you can just verify, I think. So here's an example of an atomic proposition I would use to describe the traffic light system. Perhaps we imagine me as having 2 eyes, and each eye has exactly 1 cone in it. And the cones are the devices that detect color. In one eye, I have a red cone, and in the other eye, I have a green cone. So in my brain, there is one big neuron that fires if I perceive a red light, and one big neuron that fires if I perceive a green light, right? But if I perceive a yellow light, both the red and the green neuron fire at the same time, causing me to feel twice as many feelings as I would otherwise feel, right? Which is the exact same way I felt when I got to use RSA and SHA at the same time in an electronic signature, right? Because I actually, in fact, only do have 2 neurons in my brain. But by rubbing them together, I can create thoughts. Okay. So one way to understand atomic propositions is as follows. We just have a red and a green proposition. So blah, blah, blah. Okay. I need to let you in on a little secret. I think I've managed to not show my hand too early here. But this whole time, these crib key structures, they were actually diagrams. I was just explaining them with that set theory because of who I am as a person. Here they are. They're really quite simple to look at, actually. This is not exactly the one I was working with. This is just the example of a crib key structure from Wikipedia. This is the famous one. It's like in every textbook. So it has 2 atomic propositions, P and Q. Why is that? Lowercase p for proposition, Q because it's the letter after P. So we have P and Q, and then how do they denote the states? They denote them S, subscript 1, 2, 3. These are 1 indexed. I want to point out they're 1 indexed. That is quite common in automata theory. Usually if something is 0 indexed, we're 0 indexing it for a reason, so we start at number 1 by default. Usually state 0 is going to have some sort of special properties. For example, no atomic propositions on it or something, being a sort of maybe like dummy start state. So just looking at this diagram, our set of states is 1, 2, 3. Our initial state is 1. Our relations, and I'm going to follow the relations with the mouse. Wait, I didn't make this full screen again. That's sloppy. Okay. So we have a 1, 2 relation, 1 to 2. We have a 2, 1 relation, 2 to 1. We have a 2, 3 relation, 2 to 3. And we have a 3, 3 relation, 3 to 3. This is, we're back on LaTeX here, and I want you to know that I did not escape my curly brackets in LaTeX. So the way this should work is, actually, I'll just type it out in Terminal, which is where I do all of my typing. This should equal, let's do P. Oh, that would be weird. Okay, I'm going to define P and Q. So L should equal set of tuple of set PQ. 1, and then tuple of set of Q, 2, and set of P, nope, that's supposed to be a tuple. Tuple of set of P3. And why is that? Is this going to work? Unhashable type set. Frustrating. So why should this work? Well, 1 has label PQ, 2 has label Q, and 3 has label P. So those should be in sets. And the reason they should be in sets is it's kind of weird to have a triple here and a double here. So that was kind of gross. I didn't really like that. Let's go over the traffic light example. I love traffic lights. I just do. I think they're cool. I think about them a lot, actually, probably more than is strictly speaking necessary. I got super into automata theory after I realized you could model traffic lights with them because it was really, really hard to do automata with anything before I came up with the traffic light example. So how am I going to do this? Typesetting problem. In theory, this is a graph viz. It's literally called dot dot. It's period dot is the file type. This is a dot dot graphic. I could not get subscripts to work in this thing. When I render this exact same graphic, even inside Quarto with the internal Quarto library, it renders locally with subscripts, and then it renders into HTML without the subscripts. And I think that's because it's doubly nested HTML. GraphViz has these things called HTML-like labels, which are not HTML, but they look like HTML. And the difference is they capitalize all of the element types or something. It's very odd. So you can look into it. It's a famous old engineering library, so I've been trying to use it because I feel like you're supposed to. And I just can't get it to do what I want. So anyways, those are supposed to be subscripts. I'm sorry I couldn't get it to work. If you look at the code and you compile the graphic yourself on your local device, it will look correct, which is just an extremely weird way for things to work. But anyways, the traffic light, I'm going to use 3 states to model my traffic light. We're not going to overthink what those 3 states are. You will overthink what these states are, and I'm expecting a question later, so just be ready to ask that question when it comes to your mind. So I'm going to have 3 states, and I'm going to denote them as numbered circles, right? Okay. My impression is, from our discussion earlier, we don't care what the initial state is, so we say any one of these states in our diagram could potentially be a starting state. We don't really care where we start. And maybe that's true, maybe that's false, maybe we don't. But by convention in a Kripke structure, you denote the initial starting state with an incoming arrow. This is very common in all automata, and it is common to Kripke structures. So I have 3 states, and they are all potentially starting states. The only thing this notes is that S and I are the same, and of size 3. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm not going to do the relation yet because these states aren't particularly meaningful at these times. So I'm going to label all of my states. And I'm going to label all of my states using 2 atomic propositions. And those are the atomic propositions that correspond to each one of my eyes, right? I have the red eye and I have the green eye. And both eyes activate at the same time when I see yellow. So I have the red eye, the green eye, and then the red-green eye. So this corresponds to yellow. This is just the order I thought of them in, so I used them in that order. There's not inherent meaning to the order here. This happens to be an extremely convenient order for them to be in, but this is just the naturally occurring order as I wrote it down. I guess it is perhaps kind of odd to list red before green because G is alphabetically before R, but I always perceive red as being before green for some reason, I guess in RGB. So it is higher on the rainbow or something? I don't know. At this point in time, and I'm going to toggle back and forth between these, what's the real difference here? Well, there's actually not any particular usefulness to referring to the states as S1, S2, and S3, so I stopped doing that. I'm referring to them as R, G, and Y. I can name my states whatever I want. I'm actually going to name my states the same as the observations, right? Is that cheating? Yes. It's kind of weird, but it makes the next couple slides more convenient. And then lastly, we have our transition relation. I denote this from side to top. I did not put in self edges, which would be along the diagonal. You can think of this as however you want. I think of time as advancing when I see the light change. Maybe that's not the best way to think of this. Maybe we think of time as advancing every second. If time advances every second, we would expect there to be many transitions from red to red, green to green, And even from yellow to yellow, yellow's probably lasting 3 or 4 seconds, something like that, right? I think of time only as advancing when the color changes. So there's no edges from a color to itself, just because I don't think of that as a time point. And I have added the red to green edge right here. I've added the green to yellow edge right here. And I've added the yellow to red edge right here. That looks kind of goofy, so I pulled out the initial sets and stacked it top to bottom. I spent several minutes trying to remember what order the lights are in on an actual traffic light, and I gave up. I am quite confident green is not in the middle, but I'm not like certain. Right? Is it red, yellow, green? Are you sure?
There's one traffic signal where it's an upside down because this was back when they were initially introducing traffic signals. And for some reason they wanted the it is about right. Produce green and red.
See, you don't know. Okay, all right, moving on. Okay. So we can all admit we don't know what we're doing here, I think, right? That's one thing we can all agree on. Okay. So we got red, green, yellow. For each trace point, there's an edge. You start in a start point. So how do we think of this? Let's look at a trace. I open my eyes and I perceive the world with my exactly 2 eyes, and I perceive red. That's allowed. Okay? I keep looking, I keep gazing, and I see G. My other eye activates, right? That's allowed. Here's something that's not allowed. I open my eye and I see red, and then whilst continuing to see red, I begin to see green. That's a dotted red line. That line doesn't exist. See, that's not there. See, there's not an RY. That's because you're not allowed to go from red back to yellow. Now, I don't think that's necessarily unsafe. We just didn't put it in our safety diagram, right? So this is a rejected trace. This trace is not part of the trace property that is described by this crib key structure. That's what it means. We can think of this crib key structure as either recognizing or generating traces. It doesn't really matter, but given some trace, we can determine if this crib key structure describes it. Okay? Easy peasy. This is better than nothing, I think, but it is somewhat obnoxious to specify these in text. And I personally don't have a strong fondness for the like putting your finger on an automata and like following it through things. I would like another way to do that. And so I'm going to introduce another way to do that. We're going to use as a motivating example something I feel I would be remiss to not mention this at any point in a systems class, which this is in addition to all of the other things it is, which is our most beloved handshake, the TCP three-way handshake. TCP, I think, stands for Transmission Control Protocol, and it is, what does it stand for?
Right.
Wait, can you say I'm right again? I liked that.
Never mind. You're
I checked when I was in Salem. But I got it right there too, and I have videographic evidence. Did you all see I clipped the time on LinkedIn where I issued the correction saying I thought I was wrong and I was incorrect. I was correct the whole time. That's one of my favorite clips I've ever made. I don't even remember what it was about. Oh no, it was about equivalence, right? Because I should have been saying congruent, but I wasn't wrong, which is being technically correct is the best kind of correct because you seem wrong and it still annoys people, but they can't tell you're wrong. Imagine, if you will, I'm someone that uses the internet. I know this is hard to believe, right? So we can think of it. What's that look mean? Well, I've heard of staring daggers before. I physically felt that on my person. So I know it's hard to imagine that I might use the internet for anything, right? I'm certainly not using the internet right now. Do you all see the YouTube drama with the content cop drop? You following iDubbbz and H3? No? Okay. That's fine. Oh, yeah.
Well, but I think it's worth noting that there's still
So what you're saying is I'm made out of the internet. That's such a beautiful sentiment. I think it's better if there's only one. But yeah, it's still like a nice sentiment. Like we're all stardust, right? Anyways, when I start my own religion in a few years, I think the single electron thing is gonna be banging. Everyone's gonna love that. Yeah, yeah. We'll have to make sure no one who understands science accidentally joins our cult. Okay, so imagine I'm using the internet. Um, and the thing I do when I use the internet is I like to visit my favorite website, which, as you have all determined, is tumblr.com, right? I think I sort of wear my heart on my sleeve there, right? So we imagine that somewhere on Earth there's a server that's hosting Tumblr, right? And that's the TCP server. It's hosting these things over TCP/IP, which is the couple name of the transmission control protocol and the internet protocol. We all know what the internet is. Looks like to me, when I looked into this last year when I was teaching networks, a lot of my training in network computing is related to TCP, which it seems like is basically not used anymore. The transmission control protocol was developed to solve a problem that the early internet had, which is that packages went missing all the time because the underlying hardware was borderline literal trash, right? It just did not work. That's not true anymore. I think there was a big push, mainly in my view, coming out of Amazon's Twitch and Google's YouTube, to just push large numbers of bits through the internet very quickly because they're YouTube and Twitch and they need to broadcast video, right? When they were broadcasting video, they really didn't care if they missed 1,000th of the information. No one was perceiving the loss of 1,000th of the information. A single value off in a pixel, I mean, you can lose probably large numbers of entire pixels before this is perceptible. Then you start thinking about streaming, and as you all know, I stream in Super HD at 120 FPS. Not at work, of course, only while I'm at home. But I want people to see every pore on my skin in my webcam. And so when you're moving that much data around, you can lose really large amounts of it. Like probably single-digit percents of information can just go missing and no one will perceive it. And also, once you can move that much data around, you can just start sending emails with hashes on them. And if the hash is wrong, you can just send the email like 1,000 times and get the only one that hashes correctly, right? So in the early days, when transmitting things was expensive, people put a lot of work and time and energy into making sure nothing got dropped or went missing. And then at some point, they just made the tubes on the internet big enough no one cared anymore, and they switched to UDP, which is, I think, the user datagram protocol. And that, to my knowledge, was basically invented for probably audio streaming, came into use for video streaming. And I believe it's now just used for everything. So I don't think TCP is around anymore. And that's too bad because TCP is a really, really interesting state machine, right? So we lost RSA, we lost TCP. Pretty soon I'm going to have to start getting new content from somewhere, right? I might actually have to go learn something. But I haven't fallen for it yet. So anyways, this is the TCP three-way handshake. And so this works. This is how I connect to Tumblr. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, by connect to Tumblr, you mean like typing it into the browser and all that stuff. No. I mean my operating system talking to the operating system running the server running Tumblr, right? This is extremely low-level stuff. This is us agreeing which wire we're going to use, right? So that's how low TCP is. IP is considered a layer 3 protocol. Ethernet is layer 2, and then below that you just have the one electron going in multiple directions, right? So this is the TCP server. Now, when we look at this and when we think of it as a system, we should be thinking there's an awful lot going on here. On this diagram, time proceeds through the middle of the diagram from the top to the bottom. And what this means is that at any point in time, the TCP client could have either sent a SYN, sent an ACK, or not, and could have either received a SYN or received an ACK or not. That's one nib, that's 4 bits of information, right? Over here on the TCP side, we have the same thing. It could have both seen and sent either a SYN or an ACK. That's another 4 bits. There's a variety of other things going on. These SYN messages, SYN does not stand for sinners, which I think we all saw in IMAX the day it came out, I'm sure, right? Ryan Coogler, auteur, right? Okay, but I have a Letterboxd now. I don't know if any of you heard that, so find me on Letterboxd. I'm Calvin Allegedly, right? Same as my Instagram, which I've noticed none of you followed me on Instagram either, and that's fine. Okay. Really? Oh. Oh, no, I'm extremely on social media. Sorry. I also lie a lot. I think, were you the one that asked me about Calvin facts? Yeah. Yeah, someone, I don't remember what I said the other day, but someone was like, is that a fact or a Calvin fact? I was like,
Oh, yeah.
oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah. I, I think the Calvin facts are more fun, personally. But, you know, some people disagree, right? I don't know. Anyways, potentially true facts. Like we haven't verified it's false. Um, Okay, so I got my nib over here, storing my state. I got my nib over here. What's this sin sending? Well, that sin's actually sending a timestamp. So actually, this thing over here is maintaining a timestamp. That timestamp takes up a lot of bits. That means we need a lot of state over here. Same thing's going on the TCP server. So the TCP server is keeping track of what time you think it is, what time it thinks you think it is, what time it thinks it thinks it is, what time it thinks that you think it thinks it is, right? And so all of these things are going through the TCP protocol. Extremely cool, super awesome stuff. Never going to be used again. Very sad. Pour one out for the TCP protocol. But actually, I bet it's still probably used like on airplanes. Like the internal network on an airplane is still probably on TCP. I bet because they have to make sure they don't drop anything. Right? If you like turn, well, I don't know what you do on an airplane. If you like turn off the engine, I don't know if that's something you do on airplanes, right? You have to like know that the engine turned off, right? So okay, so we got our TCP server. Blah 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 blah. You send us in, you send a snack, you send an ACK, right? Lots of states. Now, I think if I like pop this open, that's Geeks for Geeks. That's stuff. That's TCP Wikipedia. I need to match case. Okay, so there's a bunch of states that these TCP servers and clients go through. These are all of them. Your operating system is just handling this at all times. It just has to maintain all of these with every connection that's made. So I think, for example, in a web browser, I have an entire TCP stack for presumably every tab. Besides that, presumably syntax highlighting in VS Code runs over TCP IP. There's things called language servers. This is all over the place, right? And so there are 11 total states, 10 for servers and 9 for clients. What that means is 9 times 10, 90 possible states. So large number of states. And this is just a sort of famous cool thing. This is how all of the things get on the same page. So it is non-trivial to track whether sins and acts have been sent. What is the usefulness of introducing this model and talking about it a little bit? Well, traffic lights have this kind of extremely annoying feature where their state transitions and their states are the same thing. When we say a traffic light becomes red, that's an awful lot like an edge, and it's also an awful lot like a vertex, right? It's kind of both things. This TCP state gets us out of that problem. When we see a sin go from, or a sin? Yeah, I think it's pronounced sin, synchronization. When we see a sin go from a client to a server, when it lands at the server transitions from state listen to sin received. None of those things are called sin. They're completely different words, right? They don't have anything necessarily in common with the sin. It's just this thing happens to the server when the sin arrives, right? Which means we're going to need some sort of different stylistic way to describe the state transitions we're going through. Here's an example of something I actually don't know. I wrote this down as an example and I don't know how to figure it out. I think if I looked at documentation enough, I could for a while. And in fact, I've implemented the three-way handshake and I just don't remember what I did. But here's an example. I'm the client and I sin once and then I sin twice in rapid succession. And I do both of these things before the server sends me a snack. The server sends me a snack and then I send back an ACK. I don't know if that's allowed or not. And I don't think this diagram makes it clear. Because I don't know what happens if you send a bunch of sins before you get your first acknowledgement back. Right? I just don't know. So this is an example of a trace. It's a little bit ambiguous. And it's like an interesting question to ask of the TCP protocol because someone had to write this code down and decide what happens if a sin comes in before an ACK goes out. And it has to decide if the client is allowed to send multiple sins before receiving it. We do have a couple constraints that we can specify, though. The server and client, they're both going to have to see a sin at some point. The server may not send a sin or an ACK until it sees a sin, so it must be silent until it receives a sin. Notice that somehow only these quotes are wrong. What was I thinking there? Look at that. See, because these are code blocks. That's why they're changed color. Okay. The client is not allowed to ACK until it sees an ACK from the server. And the client must ACK. Everyone must ACK, everyone must SAN. They must happen in a certain order, right? Hyper-constrained system, right? Very precise, and it's very precise because it has to set up all of these timing constraints. So we need some way to describe all of these agreements, and I'm going to do linear temporal logic. Logic's the subject of the second half of our class, which we began right now, immediately after dinner. How close am I? That's not bad. That's pretty good. I was gonna offer to talk much faster and send you all home early, but I don't really want to do that. But I'm worried you're all just gonna get up and leave at 9:30 if I'm talking about dense theoretical content. We'll see what happens. I'll just speak faster as more people leave. But please stay. This stuff's interesting, I promise. If it doesn't seem interesting, that's because I'm a bad professor. It's not because the content's not cool, right? Don't blame the content. Okay. We all love traces, don't we, right? So a trace is a sequence of states. A state is something over which I can specify atomic propositions. One of the things I can do with atomic propositions is because they evaluate to true or false, I can take the or and not of them. So I can apply or and not to atomic propositions. But these ways of specifying atomic propositions, they still only describe state at some point in time. And when I'm dealing with traces, I need to describe things across multiple points in time. I need to say, for example, the server cannot send a snack until it gets a SYN, right? That's something I have to be able to specify. I must be able to say, this light cannot become red if it is currently green. I need some way to specify this. And that is not by specifying the current state, right? So we introduce two operators, and we're going to build other operators out of these. These operators are next and until. Next takes an atomic proposition and it applies it to the next temporal state. Until takes two atomic propositions, it's a binary operator, and it says the first one must be true until the second one becomes true. So we're able to compose different things out of next and until. I'm going to motivate this with composition over just atomic propositions, right? So perhaps some of you have seen this before, but this is a way of approaching composing logical operations out of other logical operations. And I think it's correct, but my brain was a little tired when I was working on this. So we build a truth table where P is true, true, false, false, and Q is true, false, true, false. The negation of P is false, false, true, true. The disjunction of P or Q is 3 trues and a false. The negation of the nots is false and many trues. And I think I want to negate this again to get to the and. So then we get true, false, false, false. So I'm able to build conjunction out of disjunction and negation, basically. The same way I'm able to build and out of or and not, I'm going to be able to build a variety of things out of next and until. I want to show you a visual representation of next and until. I have source amnesia where this is coming from. I think this is a screenshot from the paper that invented something called linear temporal logic, but this is actually just a link to one of my other slide decks, which itself doesn't have a credit in it. So I don't know where ground truth is for these things. Let's take a look at this. If I take an atomic proposition and I say this atomic proposition holds over a trace, by convention, we accept that to mean that that atomic proposition holds over the initial point in that trace. So the starting sequence, the first element, or the initial element, or the 0th element, or what have you. So if I say this trace A, that means A is true at some time point, but all later time points are not specified, right? Because A describes a state, not a sequence of states. We can also apply next to A. That means we do not care what is happening in the current state, but the immediate future state, the next state, A must be true. And then it is arbitrary after that. And then until is structured much the same way, but it is also much more restrictive. In this case, it must be the case that A holds at every trace point until B holds. And it does also require that B holds at some point in this case. So there must be some future state that satisfies B. And until that state satisfies B, every state must satisfy A. So these are next and until. I think a good example of this is maybe if you're counting time points by seconds, red until green is a natural way to do it. And then you could say green implies next yellow is another way to combine these. Okay. There are 7 total LTL operators that I see used commonly in practice. I see some of them more than the other, but all of them are built out of next and until. Next is fairly straightforward. Future means someday. So this is ambiguous amount of next, right? This is commonly used in describing things that should happen someday. So FP, if P is your transaction is accepted, this is the Bitcoin agreement. At some point in the future, your transaction, if valid, will be accepted. It is not guaranteed it will happen in the next 10 minutes. And then at some point in the future after that, you can be confident that your transaction is safe. But that time point in the future is actually time point infinity, right? So eventually it will be true. Globally is used all the time. I use globally a lot. This is usually like, oh, some register is not allowed to have some value in it. You say globally, some value doesn't equal some value. Globally, 1 does not equal 0. What was that? Did we just get locked in here?
No, the little like foot of the door was broken, so it falls down.
Okay. When I'm broken, I also fall down. So me. Finally, representation for college professors. Okay. By the way, you should all become a college professor. Okay. Is that true? I'll think about it. Okay. Until we defined previously, P holds unless Q, and Q must hold eventually. There is also release. This one's confusing because it always looks backwards to me. With until, the first argument is true. With release, the second argument is true. I don't think people use release for anything, but here's an example of when it showed up in my research. When you turn on a computer, a bunch of the bits, no one knows what's in there, right? And some of those bits describe the locations of things in memory. I've shown you in this class that all of the memory addresses in my device are 48 bits in length, which means the top 16 have to all be zeros. But when this computer's turned off, there's not zeros and there's something else in there, right? Maybe there's ones, maybe there's zeros, maybe there's things that are neither zeros or ones. No one cares, right? But here's an example of something that happens. When I press the start button, the first thing that gets power through it is the reset signal. So that reset signal is set to 1. It's a flag, so it's set to true, right? So I can just say at any point in time, atomic proposition reset, right? But that reset signal is not going to be true forever. At some point, the device is going to finish turning on and that reset signal is going to turn off. And that means everything is initialized properly, right? And so I could have the property, and this device, I'm at high confidence exhibits the property. It's not super easy to study your own device, right? But I am confident this has what releases Q. So this is reset is released by all of the memory registers having 16 zeros in their high bits. So that's a pretty complicated statement to specify over memory, right? But there's a variety of places that memory locations are specified in my device, and all of them have to start with 16 zeros. But once all of those memory locations have 16 zeros in them, then it is no longer the case that reset must be true. So reset is released to no longer be true, or is released to no longer be 1, or is permitted to be 0, is permitted to be any value, right? And we can build that out of untils, okay? Weak until is basically the same as until, but it doesn't require the thing to be true at any point in the future. So if something's true forever, that's fine. No problem. You're allowed. So I build it out of globally. Mighty release, I've never seen in my life. This is a release that has to happen eventually. This is kind of odd to me because it seems to me like if I press this reset button and the reset button is set to high and those registers aren't initialized, if I turn off my computer before they're initialized, that seems fine. That doesn't seem like a security violation. So this is something that must happen eventually and some state has to be satisfied before it happens. So it's like a little bit too complex. Usually you end up getting that with a combination of other properties, right? All right, so having introduced globally and future, which to me are the most interesting unary operators, I can now introduce the conceptions of safety and liveness. Safety and liveness are a big deal. They're maybe the most important theoretical concepts in terms of properties. And they're also going to motivate some of the security topics we're going to talk about very briefly at the end. And so when I say safety, which is not the same as security, right? Safety is that bad things don't happen. That means at every time point, the bad thing does not happen. That means if the bad thing happens once, I throw the trace in the trash and I don't look at the rest of it, right? The paper on this by Alpern and Schneider talks about this in sort of very sophisticated language using the notion of finite prefixes. So if a property can be falsified on a finite prefix of some trace, then it is a safety property, because anything bad that can happen must happen some finite amount of time after you start doing a thing. So if I watch a traffic light, I have to see a green to red transition in a finite amount of time. But as soon as I see it, it's not a traffic light, right? But I cannot, no matter how long I look at a traffic light, be certain that it will never become green, right? And I know this because I sat at a traffic light and I was 100% confident it was never going to become green. And then I left and I never found out. I think I did like a U-turn and went somewhere else. And so maybe that light is still red, but like, I don't know, right? Maybe it was in fact green and the people in Salem were just still stopped at it, right? That's another thing. You never know. I love Salem, great tacos. Okay, so the other type of thing that we care about is future good. So someday we need the light to be green. We call that liveness. Why is it called liveness? I really strongly think of this in terms of things like uptime. So it is very important to me that if I'm a small business owner with a Squarespace website that sells my sprockets and widgets and gizmos that I make, probably with my 3D printer, right? So if I sell all of those things, it's very important for me to have uptime, right? So I need my website to be live all the time. At every point in time, I want it to be online in the next 10 seconds, for example, something like that, right? And so that's a notion of liveness. And then the notion of safety is it doesn't publish the routing numbers to my bank account and also like the Unabomber manifest or like whatever you don't want to publish on your website that gets you visited by people you don't like, right? So those are examples of good and bad in the context of like, I think the like small business with a website is like a neat sense to think of this. I think we've probably all seen Social Media, great film, Justin Timberlake's in it. And in that, I think Jesse Eisenberg, who's portraying Mark Zuckerberg, and was criticized at the time for portraying him too negatively, and is now being criticized for not portraying him negatively enough, which I love. Went on some rant against Andrew Garfield, the middle Spider-Man, the Spider-Man sandwich, the one in right, about how like Facebook could never have downtime or something, and like now they have downtime, but like it seems like Instagram's never up. I don't know. I mean, like I'm on there 24 hours a day, and sometimes it's not working. So blah blah blah. Tech companies care about uptime or something. To my knowledge, YouTube has still never gone down since launching, but I've definitely seen intermediate services go down, and definitely Instagram went down there for a while, and presumably Facebook did that day too. But I'm not in my 80s, so I don't have a Facebook account. Shots fired. Okay. That's linear temporal logic. Any questions about linear temporal logic? Doesn't matter if there's no time. Okay. Bucci automata. So, Bucci automata are like pretty cool. I actually didn't know they were the same thing as deterministic finite automata until Tuesday, which is interesting because I've used deterministic finite automata and Bucci automata for very close to a decade each, and I've taught classes on both of them, and I never once realized they were the exact same thing. So that's slightly embarrassing for me. But I use them for entirely different things, because deterministic finite automata, the second letter there, F, is finite, which means I only use them for things that end. And Bucci automata I use for liveness properties, so I only use them for things that are infinite. And I never really put two and two together that they're the exact same things, and there's just this little hack. And the little hack is, if you're a Bucci automata instead of a deterministic finite automata, you never have to stop. And the way you tell if you accept a trace is if it goes through an accepting state an infinite number of times. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So, anyways, I looked at this carefully and I thought about it a lot, and I said, you know what? I should teach those students deterministic finite automata and then just say it's the same thing as Bucci automata and then move on. So I'm going to do that because I think more people have heard of deterministic finite automata than Bucci automata. Now, if I were teaching an automata theory class, which to be clear, I am not trying to get myself to be allowed to do that. So do not, under any circumstances, demand I get to teach an automata theory class, right? I would teach you about 3 automata. I would teach you about deterministic finite automata. Well, 3, I guess, because I would teach you about non-deterministic finite automata, but those are the same thing. Then I would teach you about push-down automata, which were invented by Chomsky as like a prank on other linguists or something, but are still theoretically interesting. And then I would teach you about Turing machines, which are like the cool automata, it can like do stuff, right? So you can do like do division on a Turing machine. But if you want to do division on a deterministic finite automata, I don't even know if that's possible, and I don't even know if anyone has ever tried, right? Um, and we all know how hard division is because we all heard my cover of Long Division by Bad Omens, right? Okay, so finite automata. This is finite automata. This is what they look like. I know what you're thinking. I read your minds. You say, isn't that like identical to a crib key structure? Is that what you were all thinking? Good. Okay, so what were you thinking instead of that? Sort of a head empty, no thoughts angle. You're thinking like, dang, that's a good looking automata, right? Man, I love automata. I love automata theory. That's okay. Now I know what you're thinking. Okay, thank you for sharing. So, the big difference, I teased this a little bit. I was like, when I was teaching graph theory, I should have said you're allowed to label either nodes or edges, right? All of those labels are on edges. And everyone's brain always explodes when I teach this. I don't know if it'll happen to you, but it's happened in a lot of classes. In a Bushi automata, the states in the diagram do not correspond to the states of the system it's modeling. If this thing was modeling a traffic light, the edges would correspond to light colors. And the states would correspond to what I'm thinking about while I'm looking at the traffic light, right? The states are a complete internal conception. They're very similar to having some information on your Heber stack in memory. It's internal thinking or thoughts or conception or perception of the observing entity or the monitoring entity. When I had someone in from Galois, we attempted to have a relatively complex theoretical conversation with each other very quickly in front of the students. And it was very challenging because I was referring to the automata as the system, and the automata was modeling the artificial pancreas, and the person I was speaking to, Tysa Kushner, was referring to the artificial pancreas as the system. And like communicating successfully about this because they both have states. They both calculate, they both compute, they both make decisions, they can both accept, right? But one of them is fundamentally different than the other because one of them is proving security properties about the other. And their states have nothing in common, right? Very difficult to speak about, very difficult to communicate about, extremely computationally powerful, and it is worth paying the computational cost for that reason. I considered taking crib key structures out. I don't think it is independently useful to know about crib key structures. I am so nervous that no one has ever actually understood a deterministic finite automata. I just tell you about crib key structures so you understand one automata for sure, because everyone understands crib key structures. They're not bad at all. So we're going to walk through this example. This thing's going to accept bit strings or not. That's not too exciting, but it's the example on Wikipedia, okay? Right, I was going to make my own. And what is this thing made out of? It's made out of many of the same things as the crib key structure, right? And in fact, if you want them, I have the exact slides for Bushi automata that are formatted identically to the crib key structure slides. So if you liked those, they're linked in here. You can go look at them that way. But I like my DFA slides a little better. So this is a DFA. It has states. The states are Q sub n. Why are we using Q now? I don't remember. There's a good reason, right? It has transitions, and transitions are labeled. They're labeled with sets, and they're labeled with sets of states of the system in deterministic finite automata. These come to us from the linguists. The linguists call these letters of the trace alphabet. I think that's cool. So a trace is now a string, and a state so a trace instead of being a sequence of states, is a sequence of letters, and we can call those words, right? So this is very nice because now a property is a collection of words, right? Or a language. So the linguists have similar terminology to all of this. Okay. I have states, I have transitions. The transitions are labeled with letters of the trace alphabet or states of the system I'm studying. Very confusing to have states and states, but this is states of the automata or the verifier or the observer and states of the system that is being observed, right? I have a start state, Q sub 1. Oftentimes this is specified Q naught. Here it's specified Q1. And we have an accept state, in this case it's Q3, right? And you'll notice my subscripts work in some places and not others. In the fullness of time, I will figure out how to do mathematics, okay? Our input is a finite bit string. Why is it finite? Because it's a deterministic finite automata. If you are working with a Bushi automata, it is allowed to be infinite. It doesn't matter at all, right? but it's 0, 1 to the end. Okay. Our output is a single Boolean or bit. Booleans and bits are the same things, remember? Okay. And so these Booleans and bits, which are the same things, you just get one of them back. And that one of them denotes whether the automata accepts some trace or some word. The set of bit strings for which the output is 1 is the property captured by the automata. So there's some set of strings that are accepted by the automata, a set of strings, a set of traces. This is a property, okay? So the automata and properties are logically equivalent. This is just a way of describing a property, okay? The way to find this out is you put your hand or your finger on the automata, you begin and start, you read a symbol, you follow the edge that's labeled with that symbol, and then you keep doing this. Let's do an example. We're going to just take the empty string. When we have the empty string, we haven't read any symbols yet. I'm going to store it in a Python list and put it up here and just try and track through it. Okay, so our initial state is Q1. So if we haven't seen anything yet, we are in Q1. Now, what does this mean? This is something different. When we were looking at traffic lights before, we needed a different starting state for red, yellow, and green. And that's because the states corresponded to our observations. If we were modeling a traffic light this way, we would start in the same state no matter what, and then we would have outgoing edges labeled red, green, and yellow. So the edges correspond to the states we see. Okay? So I don't see anything yet, so I'm in Q1. I see a 0. I'm in Q1, so I look for the edge going out of Q1, labeled 0. It's this edge, so I stay in Q1. I see a 1, and I'm currently in Q1, so I look for the edge labeled 1. It's this edge, so I go to Q2. Easy. Now, if I see a 1, I will go to Q3, and if I see a 0, I will go to Q1. Okay? I see a 1, so I look for the edge labeled Q1. I see it goes to Q3, so I go to Q3. I note Q3 is double circled. That means it's an accept state. This means that once I get here, if I stay here, then I accept. In a Bushi automata, I have to go spend an infinite amount of time in Q3. In a deterministic finite automata, after I read the last letter of the finite string, so there's always a last letter because it's finite, I have to be in Q3. Okay? Let's keep going. I can read a 0. I check Q3 for an outgoing edge labeled 0. It's right here. So I stay in Q3. And then if I see a 1, the outgoing edge is labeled 1, so I stay in Q3. So you basically stay in Q3 once you get there. We can think of this as a trap state. Now, this is over a binary system, so this is the universe of all possible states. Okay? So this is the path through the automata used by 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. And this edge is never used. This would happen if we saw a 1 followed by a 0 without seeing a second 1. Okay? Do you want to do the exercise or do you want to keep going? Do the exercise. You weren't opinionated enough. I have to get more water. You can work together if you want.
If you know what
Like clockwork robots.
I think it is.
So too.
So the answer is no.
Well, I mean, I would say if it doesn't have to go to Q3, does it?
I don't think it makes it to Q2. So there's no 0 eventually into Q2.
Well, the 0 edge leads from Q1 back to Q1.
That's the first. And then the second, you can try this also 0.
So it stays at Q1.
Notice it just doesn't.
I don't even have a read.
0 takes it back to.
No, I would know who this is. This is City's Skylines.
Like using people playing SimCity and that's true. When you're playing SimCity or you buy Bitcoin.
Yeah, not doing higher.
Okay, does it accept or not? Why not? This automata captures the property T1 literal. That's the only way to get to the accept state is that. So you can either follow it all the way through, or you can look at the automata program your brain. Right. So yeah, what do we do? Q1, Q1, Q2, Q1. Good work. Going to introduce you some more verbiage. We say A is the language of M1. That's just introducing the term. M1 is an automata. It describes some set of bit strings. Those bit strings are the language. They're called the language because the linguists came up with this before the mathematicians, right? I don't know what words a mathematician would have used, right? Probably we're talking about sequences here, and then sets of sequences, right? Which is sort of how I did it with the crib key structures. We say M1, or the machine, right? M1 for machine. So a DFA. We say M1 recognizes A. We do not often think of deterministic finite automata as generators. We don't sort of turn one on and it starts spitting strings out, right? Rather, we provide it with a string and it gives us 0 or 1. Now, of course, we can use them as generators. You can say, oh, I start in this state, and you can just breadth first search the thing or something, right? But we don't think of them that way because it's not useful. And then terminology that is used from time to time is A equals L of M1. And so that's commonly used shorthand in proofs about things like formal languages. Automata theory is really cool. I have not really successfully convinced myself it's either useful or not. So for me, I haven't decided yet. I'm going to continue to teach little bits of it in my life until I come to a strong conclusion. I'm going to note what language we describe here. Some string W, why W for word. So word is an element of the language if there exists some index less than the length of the word minus 1, such that the letter at that index is 1 and the next letter is 1. Wait a minute. This is introducing an LTL expression using indices, right? This is future 1 and next 1. Logically identical. It's also very easy to write in Python. Fun fact, Python is actually an automata. But it's a Turing machine, so it's a little more common. Okay. Stick with me here. I'm about to introduce the transition relation, which everyone freaks out about, justifiably, because it's a very strange mathematical object. Finite automata is formally defined as a 5-tuple. The first element of the tuple is Q, big Q. It's a finite non-empty set of states. These set of states have nothing to do with the states of the system you are observing. These are the thoughts you are thinking while you are looking at the system. That's the best way I've come up with to describe it so far. I've actually watched a lot of lectures and talks from other people trying to explain automata theory, and no one else seems to have a good way to explain this either. I bet someone's going to come up with one someday. There's going to be rapid progress on this because LLMs have an internal state that's dramatically different than the string they just produced. So someone's going to find some way to explain this to toddlers in the next 6 months, and then I never have to think again. But those words don't exist yet. They will come around. So I have a finite non-empty set of states. Here's what the linguists use. They say they have big sigma. I'm specifying big sigma. That's capital sigma. Greek letter, this one. I have a finite non-empty set of input symbols called the alphabet. I love calling this thing the trace alphabet because those are the systems, those are the states of the system I observe, That is red, green, yellow. Okay? Then I have the transition relation. The transition relation is going to determine when I see something in the system, what I am thinking about, my state. So I see something and I think something. But I have a thought in my head before I see something. The thought in my head is an element of Q, the set of my states. The thing I see is little sigma, an element of big sigma, right? And then the thing that I get out of that is what I am thinking now. Okay? So I'm thinking something, I see something, and then I have a new thought, right? I'm not going to get too far into cognitive science, but this is like, that's learning and changing, right? This is kind of the basis of machine learning. Whatever. Okay, I have a question. Machine learning, many of you are in Data 505. Are you doing the Craven speed data set? Okay. What are you doing for your final? You have to pick your own data set. I made them all do the same data set. Okay. Wait, no, I skipped something. There's the initial state. Okay. There's the thing you think when you wake up in the morning. When I wake up in the morning, I think, oh, that's a cute kitty, because there's a kitty laying on top of me. My cat has now opened up completely. She's still supposed to live in my room because we have the other cat and we're nervous about introducing them. I like went to the bathroom in the middle of the night and I came back and she was like on the couch in the living room. And I don't know how she got there that fast because she like clanks when she moves around because the Humane Society like trimmed her claws and she like walks around on the hardware and goes like, it's very cute. But yeah, somehow she snuck past me and was like vegging on the couch. And I was like, you're a cat. You don't appreciate couches. And she said, oh. Anyways, that's a true story. Probably going to do it again today. Then we have F. F is the set of accepting states. It is the final states. It is a non-strict subset of Q. I use strict subset there. I think there's 2 typos on this, or 3 typos on the slide, but I'm not sure. I think there's supposed to be a colon here. I think either this is supposed to be capital sigma, or this is supposed to be lowercase q, but I think I want this to be capital sigma. And I think that's supposed to be non-strict. So I think those are the case, but I would have to think about this a lot to know for sure if there's errors in here. Domino theory is just hard. Here's the explanation. I did this already. Here's our example. I showed you 3 things. And so Q1, Q2, Q3. And the alphabet is 0, 1. How am I going to express delta, the transition relation? You'll love this. It's kind of a matrix, but it's a matrix over things that aren't exactly numbers, right? So on the top, I have the observation. On the left, I have the thing I am currently thinking. And so if I am thinking Q1 and I see a 0, then I begin thinking Q2. And Q2 means if I see one more 1, then I can accept. If I'm in Q2 and I'm thinking, if I see one more 1 I can accept, then I see a 1, I go to Q3. And in Q3, I'm thinking, I can accept this. You know, this is acceptable. This offering is acceptable, right? I wrote this in Python. You can actually run these things. You can actually program this way if you don't have a lot of hobbies. This is very, very close to regular expressions, for those of you that are into that. But anyways, this is the most inefficient way to write programs I've ever come up with, and I teach a class in C89. Okay? So, okay, hear me out, right? So, like, you're an electrical engineer in 1955, right? And someone's like, we need you to make a computer. And you're like, yes, that is a job title for humans that use an abacus very well. And they're like, no, we need you to make it out of this vacuum tube and this stack of wires. And you're like, I cannot make you a computer, but I can make you a deterministic finite automaton. It's like, yes, you can do that, right? You can imagine making this out of circuitry, right? I was reading the C# Quick Start Guide from Microsoft while I was waiting for my coffee at Archive the other day, because that's what I've been reduced to. And it described computers as having a bunch of tiny switches in them. It can either be on or off. And I was like, that's extremely cute, right? Like a computer's just a bunch of switches. Because they're scared of telling the C# programmers about bits. Yeah, so I was in there today, and it was like a new person who didn't know me, and so I had to order, which I like never have to do. It was very weird. But I went down early. It's one of the faculty's birthdays today. One of us turned 40. That's how old we are. I don't know how old any of you are, but I feel like one of us turned 40, and we all feel like death now. Um, I've been giving my age in hexadecimal to seem younger, so I'm 20, right? String is a sequence of letters. A letter is a set of strings. Hey, this looks an awful lot like trace properties, right? The empty string is a zero length. What is that? That is big sigma to the zero. So that represents a sequence in sigma of length 0. The empty language is the empty set. That's the null set. This should be a bullet point, and I thought it was. I remember looking at this slide. We previously used the term trace the way DFAs use string. Okay. The empty string and the empty language have nothing in common. The empty language is the null set. The empty string is an element of what could not be an empty set. Okay, so for some reason, I don't know why this is, you teach this class, everyone understands this initially, and then in 2 weeks, they're like, oh, the empty language, that's the language that exactly contains the empty string. No. The language that contains the empty string, that is a language. That is not the empty language, because it contains something, it's not empty, okay? Glad we got over that. Okay. So we define acceptance. It's not too bad. Basically, we need for every letter in the word. So we take the word, right? These are the letters in the word. We can also say, hey, this is the trace. And these are the states. Doesn't matter. Every word must be an element of the acceptable letters or states. And there's going to exist this thing. What's this thing? This is a sequence of my states, the things I'm thinking. Those are the sequence of cues, right? Okay. So the first one has to be the initial state. The last one has to be an element of the allowable final states. And then at every point in time, you must be able to produce the next state by applying delta to the current state in the thing you observe. That's all. You can never fall off the automata. You have to start in the start state. You have to end in the final state. Easy, trivial. So now you know about deterministic finite automata and also DFAs. Okay? Does anyone want to ask any questions about DFAs? Doesn't matter. We don't have time. Okay. So safety and liveness. Oh, actually, we did have time. Does anyone want to ask any questions? I noticed none of you asked what deterministic means. That's good. Don't ask that. That's for later, right? Safety and liveness. They're back. Okay. It's one of my all-time favorite papers. It burdened my heart to not assign you this paper, but I wanted you to read Joel on software being unhinged instead, because I think it's good to know that people can act like that and keep jobs. Now, in fairness to him, he did that by quitting his job and starting his own company. So I don't know what lesson is to be learned there. No, I do. You should quit your jobs and start your own company. Okay, so this is Alpern and Schneider, and a lot of people don't know this. I'm commonly mistaken for a computer scientist. And that is a vicious smear against me. I'm actually a mathematician, which you can tell, because I cited Bowen Alpern in my thesis. And this person is a staff member in the mathematics department. And we're just going to paper over that it's at IBM. Okay? So this is a mathematician, okay? Right? And that's the first author on this paper, right? Schneider's still active in publishing. At least in 2010, a very, very influential paper came out of Snyder's group, which was the Clarkson and Snyder hyperproperties paper, which is extremely cool and also 72 pages long. Did I make that? I think it's 72 pages, hyperproperties. What if I just type this in? Oh, my God, it's 55 pages. What a completely reasonable length for something that is this dense. Look at this. There's 55 pages of this stuff. I had to give, like, I don't even know what that means. My oral examination to get my PhD was over this paper and 9 other papers, but this paper was like as long as the other 9 put together. I remember asking my advisors, they're like, is there a shorter version? And she found like a 22-page conference version that was published in a conference, because this thing isn't even peer reviewed. They just published it on their website. They're like, hyperproperties, lock in. And everyone thought it was awesome, and it is. Unfortunately, this one got in a journal, I guess. In 2010, right? This is a long time ago. Anyways, hyperproperties became extremely important when the first security violations that used hyperproperties were discovered in, like, I can get the year of Spectre. Yes, they anticipated it by 8 years, which is pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive to describe the logical system needed to describe a bug that will be described in 8 years that has been persistent in physical hardware for over a decade by the time they wrote that paper. So I don't know. That's pretty cool. When I grow up, I want to be that smart. But I'm never going to grow up because I'm Peter Pan. Okay. A formal characterization for safety properties and liveness properties is given in terms of the structure of the Boucher automaton that specifies the property. The characterizations permit a property to be decomposed into a safety property and a liveness property whose conjunction is the original. Let's take a look at the traffic light. I'm thinking of the traffic light very strongly at this time in two senses. I am not allowed to see a red right after I see a green, and I want to see a green eventually. One of those is safety, one of those is liveness. This is both. What's going on here? This is basically implemented as if S1 means red, as if S2 means green, and as if S3 means yellow. Why is that? Well, all of the incoming edges to them are labeled that way. So S1 means the thing I'm thinking is I just saw red. S2 is I just saw green. S3 is I just saw yellow. What is the real takeaway here? This is very close to being a complete graph, so a graph between all nodes, right? And what is the absence of completion? There is not a red node leaving S2. So while I'm thinking I just saw green, I'm not allowed to see red, right? That's all that's going on. Traffic lights don't have to stop someday, so not days. That's great. Okay. Bad thing won't happen. Bad thing happens, system's unrecoverable. But the system's unrecoverable, the only thing that can happen is you have to fall off the automata. Because as long as you're on the automata, you might still end up in the accepting state. So if it is a safety violation, it must result in you no longer being defined by the automata. Okay? Now, what this means is that if an automata describes a safety property, since the only way you can reject a trace is if you fall off the automata, that means every state in your automata should be an accepting state. Let's look at an example. This is green to red. So what do we have here? S1 denotes I just saw green. That's why all green edges go to S1. And the only outgoing edge from S1 is yellow. And then otherwise, we just stay here. So if we don't see green, we stay in S2. If we do see green, we go to S1. So there's only one undefined edge on here because this is the negation, right? So this is the universal set leaving S0. We have the universal set leaving S2. And then we only require Y coming out of S1. So the only bad thing that can happen is reject here. Now, by convention, I should have put all of these in double circles because these are all accept states. The only thing that can go wrong is I see an R while I'm in S1, right? So this is a safety property. This is the safety property, red after green, okay? Now, I didn't realize this. I have disclosed and tried to be clear that I spent a lot of time making these slides and I was very tired the whole time, but I do think this stuff is really cool. So I did want to show it to all of you. I shouldn't have used S1 and S0. I should have just kept everything here, I think, right? Because I could have recycled one of these two states. I don't actually need three states for this. I only need to have known I just saw green. So I think I could have simplified this. Actually, I'm going to write it on the board. I think I That's S1. That's supposed to be on there. Fine. Okay. So, common theory is easy because this is way and I realize this happens. Okay. Now, maybe you're all smart. Good. Good. Also, for some reason, I labeled this graphic blockchain. I was surprised too. I did not think this was a blockchain, but it's clearly labeled. Okay, let's introduce closures. Y'all heard of closures before? That's good. That was right. That was a trick question, right? Um, So the way we define closure with these mathematical objects is like the way it's useful to do so, right? And so Alpert and Schneider, they just invented this thing and they had to call it something, so they called it closure. They said, look, the closure is when you set all of the states to be accepting states. Why not? Right? And so if a Boucher automata accepts the same traces as its closure, then it's a safety property for the exact reasons we outlined. I was skipping some things because I thought they weren't interesting, so I moved ahead 3 slides. If you're following along at home, I moved ahead 3 slides. I want to point out this property, and I think it is more strongly approximated by the one I wrote on the whiteboard. So if you're on YouTube, I'll update these slides someday, I guess, probably. That was slide 117. Globally, next red implies not green. If I'm about to see red, I can't be looking at green. That makes sense. It also makes sense that that implies would be an arrow on the graph, right? And then we also have globally not green or not next red. Boucher automata and linear temporal logic are logically equivalent. They're provably logically equivalent. You can write the proof. Deterministic finite automata are logically equivalent to these things called regular languages, which are quite similar. And they also have closures defined over them. If you are looking for something to do that's a little bit theoretical, writing this proof is a blast. You'll want to follow a guide. There's this intermediate trick you use where you create a generalized automata, which is you prove a bunch of properties that basically say the edges of your automata can be labeled with LTL expressions, which they can be. And then you perform a series of reduction operations that turn an automata into an LTL expression. It's super cool. Every single step is simple, and the end result basically shows the equivalence between computers and languages, which is like a really strong claim to make, right? Very cool thing. I think yeah, I mean, it literally has a Wikipedia page. And this is not that bad. This is, what, a couple thousand words? And I suspect some of these are in, yeah, there's like automatic translators. I don't know, these things are just cool. So check it out if you're looking for something to do in a more theoretical sense. The benefit of doing this stuff theoretically is not that you're likely to do it in real life. It's that you'll realize something about the way the world works and carry that forward. Is that an airplane? Sounded like a rocket ship. That was loud. Okay. I'm not easily distracted. Okay. Sorry, what was that? That's a Gelf, in fact. I have an iron will. I'm doing a good job. Okay. What's going on here? I missed a space in between F and good. So the underscores got converted back into underscores instead of rendering in italics. It's 147 slides. So I went to the modern geometry class that's before my class today because one of my advisees was presenting something called GJK connections, which is like some collision ray trace algorithm in computer graphics. I don't know, it seemed interesting. Student had like 8 slides and worked on it for an entire semester. You know how tilted I was when I saw that? I made 147 slides since Friday. This is all I've done. I do this for fun now. I'm completely unhinged. Okay, so if a Boucher automata is a liveness property, no matter what happens, the system is recoverable. What's that mean? That means it can't have any undefined edges. That means no matter what letter you see at any given time, you have to stay on the Boucher automata. So the only way you can reject things, if you're a liveness property, is by not getting to an accept state. What's that mean? That means that the closure, if I change all of my states to accept states, it has to accept every single string. Because the only way I rejected things was by not being in an accept state. So that means every possible string must be in some state, which means if I change all of my states to be accept states, then I must accept every possible string. that blew my mind. I thought that was really cool. It's okay if it didn't blow your mind, but I think it's really cool. Once again, I only needed 3 states here, but I don't even know how I only need 2. Can I figure it out? Okay, yeah, I can do this. Do any of you want to try and convert this into an equivalent 2 state before I do it? Think about how you do it, at least a little bit, but I don't think you'll have a sense. It's easy, but it's irritating. Um, we must have gradient benchmark, and we started. Have to have gradient benchmark. That's this is has to be like literally has some averages here. I'm gonna put little segments and have everything. I think that's what I did up there. I just have. It makes sense. That's 123.
What is the second one?
Any letter.
Sorry.
Any letter. So that's lowercase sigma, so any of the elements of big sigma. There's a lot of other ways this is written. You can write true there, because true is always true, and these are atomic propositions. And then you could also write the universal set. I could write RGY there. I can write whatever I want. A way I have stylized this but it's kind of like little sigma. I've seen a lot of people teach this, and I've never seen a way to denote this idea that these things. So little sigmas and a third any other.
Funny question. I may have been misunderstanding this whole thing. But why can't we just stay in not reading forever?
It's not an accept state.
Or,
So you don't fall off the ground, but it doesn't return on.
or,
And then that is exactly what you should be asking, right? Because when I take the closure of this, now an exception.
so now you could be a not.
Yes, and you have accepted no matter what years. This is quite similar to the earlier one we saw, where it's just like you know if you want, I have CK bumps at some point. Well, you never fall off that thing. So by taking closure, that makes sense.
Okay, it's okay.
Do you want to ask a follow-up question?
Uh,
It makes perfect sense to me.
my mind was going in a different direction.
Okay.
But I don't think there would make sense.
Do you want to say that? Maybe it's interesting.
I kind of forgot this.
Keep me posted.
Yeah, just the follow-up question.
Take the closure means take all the states and convert them to accepting states. The way a Bushi automata accepts a string or a trace is that there's no undefined transition, so you don't fall off the automata. And when you run out of string to read, you're in an accept state. So there's 2 ways you can say no to a string. You can either fall off or end in a non-accept state. When you take the closure, you eliminate the not end in an accept state possibility. This is the definition of closure. CLA is equivalent to A if the set of accepting states F is expanded to include all the states of A. If the closure accepts everything, it's a liveness property. So that's how we specify this. I think this is non-obvious, so I'm going to highlight what the difference is here. When I take the closure of something, A, closure of A, Q is the same. Sigma is the same. Q is what I think, sigma is what I see. Delta is the same. That's how I decide what I'm thinking after I see something. Q naught is the same. That's the first thing I think. I think, boy, I hope I see a red, yellow, or green, right? F is the set of accepting states in the closure. The accepting states is every state. I would make this a double circle. I would make this a double circle. Variety of ways to convert things to liveness properties. The most common way. I'm just going to say this out loud. This could be an entire lecture. You take every letter that doesn't have a labeled outgoing edge from every node, and you point them all to a state called Q-trap. And then you give Q-trap a true self-edge. Q-trap is not an accepting state, so all those things get rejected anyways. They're going to get rejected by falling off, but now it's a safety property because you capture all of them if you accept. So doesn't really matter. So that's adding a trap state. Adding trap states is like, it's hard to come up with good examples that need trap states, so I have historically not taught them, but be advised if you like need something, if you're like doing automata theory, you can just like add a state, put some edges into it. Like you can always do that. Right? So you're all familiar with set intersection, right? That's what I thought. I thought we were all familiar with set intersection. And we're all familiar with how trace properties are just sets of traces, right? So that means I can take the intersection of two properties, right? Okay. Yeah.
Isn't that the, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that the U?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if it matters. We'll see. We'll take a look at it. Yes, it is supposed to be intersection. Yeah. Oh, one's cup and one's cap. That's what got me. That's cup and it's supposed to be cap, I think.
I think I was thinking that like the U means.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one was intersection.
Yeah, good catch. Thank you. That's incredible you're paying that much attention right now. I'm genuinely impressed. Good job. Yes. So that is supposed to be intersection, and it is stylized incorrectly, slide 127. I wonder if I'll remember all these typos. I bet I will. I care a lot about these slides. I had a lot of fun with them. Okay. So I can't look at it. It's embarrassing to me now. Every trace property is the intersection of a safety property and a liveness property. The traffic light property is the intersection of the safety property, no red after green, and green eventually. I could express that as future green and globally next red implies yellow. I could also express it as the various automata I've shown you today. But critically, that future designated LTL expression, that's a liveness property. It only has if it's nothing is going to happen to it until it sees that green. So all of the edges are defined. And then there's the safety property, which is you cannot have an edge from green to red. So somehow you combine those, right? In the safety and liveness paper, they give you an algorithm to construct things in both directions. It could be interesting to you. To me, the much more interesting thing is that no matter what I say about a system, I can decompose it into safety and liveness. And that mattered to me a lot. In my research, I pretty quickly found out the only thing that seems to matter right now is something called 2-safety. 2-safety is a hyperproperty. That's the new thing in 2010. But that's a specific form of safety you get. Looks like liveness is not real. A lot of the things we perceive as liveness, like, I like really need this website to be online. No, all those things have time bounds on them, which means they're actually things that can be falsified on a finite trace, right? You say, like, No one cares that the website might come up again someday, right? Like it just, if you're down for 10 minutes, you just start bleeding money, right? I have a colleague, she went to high school together, that works in game development. And I guess the way a lot of gaming works with microtransactions now is you make just a fixed amount of money per minute while the servers are up. So when a server goes down on an online game, you just lose revenue until it's back online, right? So their sort of safety policy as a company is like, if servers go down for like 60 hours in 1 week, we go out of business, right? Like that's not a liveness property, right? That's a safety property. That's the bad thing that can't happen, right? So, and I've been around and I've talked to a few people about these. There's these things called execution monitors, which someone on my dissertation committee argued to me was liveness. And I don't know. To me, we've never actually looked at anything other than safety because we've never run a computer for an infinite number of minutes. That's just like an absurdity, right? So to me, liveness doesn't exist. But it's, it's academically interesting to consider liveness. And you can say liveness does matter on finite traces, right? So I can say, in the next 60 minutes, this liveness property has to be satisfied. It's like, sure, whatever, right? That's fine. Let's take a look. Oh, I kind of want these on the. I'm gonna split this. Ah, it's Alpern and Schneider. Okay. Okay. So, I wonder how long that chair's been there. I was like playing with fire for a long time, and it finally got me. Okay. So here we go. Comment on the left. Every single A, B read is defined. Any other letter is undefined. So what does that mean? The safety version of this is any string that contains only A and B, right? And then the liveness property is any string that ends in A. I suggested one way to think of this is we imagine this Bushi automata being not over the letters A, B, but being over the full lowercase alphabet. And so I've expressed that as follows, right? So the safety property is a, b, a, ab, ba, b, a, ab. And the liveness property is a, ba, ka, da, I, fa, ga. I know you like it when I do it. That's why I do that. Okay. But what is this? Well, ga is not part of this automata, right? But if I turned this into just expressing the liveness property, right? Well, then we have to define all of the transitions, right? And so when we define all of the transitions, we capture the A termination, right? And then we want to say, okay, what's this thing actually accept? Well, this accepts strings that contain only A and B that terminate in A. So it accepts A, oh, it's not on. Oh, no, it also accepts ABBA, right? And it accepts these things, right? So if I take the intersection of these things, what do I get? I get strings that only contain A and B and strings that end in A. And that's exactly what this captures, right? I'm sure that was persuasive. Okay. Safety is the bad thing happening. So safe of M is the closure. This is the core nicety. This is why Bushi automata are cool and nice to think about. Because if we need to know what the safety property is, we literally just take the closure, right? Liveness properties are non-trivial. You have to add these trap states, but that's not too bad either. So if we consider this over the alphabet of lowercase letters, then we need to have the liveness property. And the way to do that is you just take something that says not A or B, not A or B, and it goes to Q2. That's all. And then Q2 has a loop that says true. Do I need to draw that? No, I trust you. You understand it. Trap states. Wait, why did I not make this full screen? What am I doing? I perpetually feel like I'm being pranked, and I can't tell if it's because I'm like, my baseline weirdness is so high you can never tell when I'm doing a bit. When I think of liveness, I think really strongly about the trace alphabet, right? If I'm dealing with a liveness property, there is no state I can look at that is bad. So this is odd from a computing perspective, right? Because there are many things we can put in our computers that are bad, right? Every seg fault is a total disaster. But really all it means is like whatever your state is, no matter what letter you see, you have an outgoing edge with that letter on. Okay. These links, this goes to my Theory of Computing DFA lecture. This goes to my Cybersecurity Bushi Automata lecture. This goes to my Cybersecurity LTL lecture. And this goes to my Cybersecurity Safety and Liveness lecture. These are formatted differently. The style won't be exactly the same. I have reviewed all of these this week, and I thought they were relatively high quality. So if you want to learn more, follow these links. Okay. And with that, I thought I would start teaching cybersecurity. We have 20 minutes left this term, and so I thought it was high time to get to it. Fortunately, there's only 5 cybersecurity concepts, so I can spend 4 minutes on them each, and we can still get out of here on time, right? This is an exact quote from the Information Security Department at Washington University of St. Louis, what I think of as one of the foremost engineering programs in undergraduate education in the country. You're not undergraduates, it's just that's why I've heard of them, right? The CIA triad always weirds me out a little bit because it's named after one of the 3-letter agencies, which is pretty creepy. And I don't think people that do computer security often think of it in these terms. The main place I see the CIA triad seems to be in people that are selling me courses to get certifications, which has led me to view it with inherent suspicion. Nevertheless, integrity is an extremely useful term, and it is the term I think of quite strongly with respect to SHA. I'm going to read this quote, and I'm reading exact quotes here because I'm not teaching you something that I necessarily believe in or necessarily makes sense to me, but I am teaching you something you should know and something that I know, right? This is useful information. The CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability is a guiding model in information security. A comprehensive information security strategy includes policies and security controls that minimize threats to these 3 crucial components. Confidentiality refers to protecting information from unauthorized access. I believe I taught you this term in excruciating detail. This is big RSA. If you RSA encrypt something, it is so close to invincible, it doesn't matter. I think every once in a while someone asks me about Shor's algorithm. I'm not worried about it. Like, I don't think it's going to happen, right? I think if something is secure for the next 40 years, I can just like wait 20 years and re-encrypt it in 2 decades, right? RSA is extremely robust. And in fact, RSA is already being sunset, and ECDSA will protect us well past the life of Shor's algorithm, right? So I think you have an extremely strong command of how to achieve confidentiality. You achieve confidentiality with RSA. I elected not to teach AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, this term. That is also a confidentiality technique, and it just didn't look interesting. You can take a look at it. I found it mathematically cool, and then I looked at how you would teach it mathematically, which is extremely tedious because you implement it with table lookups. Then I looked at how you would write it in code, and it's even more table lookups. Like, it just looked miserable. So I think I spared you from table lookups except for the seeding values in SHA, and you could have computed those if you wanted to. Integrity means data are trustworthy. I'm going to say one thing. People that use data as a plural are inherently suspicious to me, okay? And the reason for that is because Freakonomics were the first people that did this, right? Okay. Integrity means data are trustworthy. It just sounds like, do you all use it as a plural? Oh, you do? Okay. I don't trust you. Okay. How long have you been doing it? Oh, you were 12. You didn't know better. That's fine. Okay. I absolve you. It's those parents that are scientists. It's just like, you're never coming back from that, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're hanging out, like eating dinner, and you have to start doing hypothesis testing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. I think the real trick, and this is how you bamboozle everyone, you just only use data as an adjective. Right? Integrity means your data frames are trustworthy. It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't put it in that frame, right? I taught the entirety of Data 505 in Salem, only ever saying data set, data frame, or data point. I'm not about to join a cult, right? Okay. Trustworthy, complete, and have not been accidentally altered or modified by an unauthorized user. That is the most SHA thing that has ever SHA'd. Like, the only thing SHA does is tell you if someone's been fidgeting with bits, right? And now it happens to be so unbelievably good at that. They happen to just like write a signature protocol around it, which I would not have, that would not have occurred to me, right? But that's SHA. Okay. So the last thing, availability. Availability means data are accessible when you need them. That's liveness. That's why I taught you liveness today, right? I taught you 2 different automatas in LTL just so I can say I've taught you availability. And was I going to teach you those 2 automatas in LTL anyways? Yeah, probably, right? But we can say it's for liveness, right? Yeah. Availability. Okay, that was a close one. Integrity and confidentiality, those are definitely safety, right? As soon as the information leaked, it's an unrecoverable fault, right? Big selling you certifications needed to invent more pillars for the CIA triad because too many people were getting certified, so they invented 2 more. They invented authenticity and non-repudiation. I'm a specialist in authenticity. You know this because you all follow me on social media where I am my authentic self and I'm not at all ever in character, right? Now, non-repudiation, somewhat actually like integrity. I think non-repudiation is a real thing, and I think it's the most blockchain thing that has ever blockchained. Let's step through this real quick. Authenticity is the property that an entity is what it claims to be. That's digital signatures. If I digitally sign something, either someone else has my key or I signed it. And I would argue, again, it's not people, but keys that are signing these things anyway. So there's no way to falsify that. The only way to falsify it is to have the key. And if you have the key, that's a separate security problem, right? If there is a confidentiality breach on your private key, then you cannot achieve authenticity. Right? Something I don't really love about authenticity, this is 2 A's. We have availability and authenticity. I think they should have named this something else. There's a notion of like impersonation is the negation of authenticity. So like anti-impersonation, that's an A too. I don't know exactly how they'd achieve it. Separately, authenticity, I think, predates availability. There's these, before the term security was used that much, there was a lot of discussion of things like access control. And you authenticate to perform access control. And everyone was doing access control well before they were doing availability. So we could argue this is actually a more fundamental concept. I think why this hasn't been carried forward onto like the certs and things is it's just a little bit more sophisticated. There's a few too many moving parts. And I really feel with that as this being a synthetic thing that I built out of CNI, right? Last one is non-repudiation. This is proof of work. Non-repudiation is defined as the ability to prove the occurrence of a claimed event or action and its originating entities. I believe, and I don't know, I never heard the term non-repudiation until proof of work became widely discussed. I think non-repudiation is the generalization of proof of work. Proof of work is the most established one of these, but I think Ethereum uses something called proof of stake that in theory is maybe, I found it unpersuasive when I read the paper, but like it's persuaded other people, so that's fine. So this is proof of work, and you could argue it's authenticity as well, because the occurrence of the claim event might have to include who the occurred event happened to. So this is non-repudiation, and this is blockchain. And it really is blockchain. It's not Bitcoin, it's blockchain. Any blockchain does this, right? This is what I think I've taught you today. I pulled the mention of the specific automata, right? This is not the totality of what I think I've taught you this term. I realized when I wrote this down, I missed 2 things, but we'll just go through this. We will see, and I will go to national accrediting bodies, but I think I am actually very close to fitting an entire computer science degree in one course, and you can debate the merits of that or not, right? So I certainly haven't taught you to make a compiler or an operating system, but not everyone that gets a CS degree knows how to do those things. I have not taught you any web development, but if you can't do web development with what I've taught you, that's sort of on you, I think, right? I believe I've taught you about pointers, memory safety, and recursion. I think recursion is harder than everything else there is. Not because it's particularly hard, but because there's no problems you can't solve with recursion. So it's odd to claim that if you understand recursion, there's something else you don't understand, right? Pointers are nasty, but my impression is you seem to be handling pointers pretty well from what I've seen. And in fact, being able to parse these automata, that's the same thing as understanding pointers, right? I think I've taught you all of the principal data structures. I strongly think that there's 5 data structures: list, stack, heap. I prefer to call them hash trees to maps, and then tree. Every once in a while, someone will try and stick like queue or graph in there. To me, those things live somewhere else. I think I've taught you quite a bit of modern development. I've definitely taught you containers and continuous integration. And separately, I have taught you design patterns. Um, I don't know that I'm particularly good at teaching those things, but I think I showed them to all of you. And I hope I showed you enough about containers that you'll have like a nagging itch to teach yourself more, which is sort of how I've been learning containers. No one's ever taught me containers or talked to me about containers. I just found out about them. I've been playing around with them since then. I've taught you systems programming. This thing seems to be absent from a lot of curriculums, which is surprising to me. But you know C89, you know make, and you know shell scripting, right? You've probably seen shell scripting in some of your other classes. Have you seen make in Data 503? Does it show up? Okay. I would not use containers without make if it were up to me. But I've taught you cryptography, and specifically, I really think I've taught you the only cryptography that matters, which is RSA and SHA. Someday ECDSA will matter. It does not matter yet, right? I've taught you number set, graph, and automata theory. And then I've taught you what I think is basically the totality of 1 semester of cybersecurity education. I am a reviewer. I am on the AP, like college board, people that design the cybersecurity curriculum, and it is the things I taught you in the last 20 minutes, right? And with the high schoolers, you do things where you have them draw the threat models and talk about them with each other. I don't think you need to do that, right? There are 2 other things on here that I have taught you. I've taught you actually a good bit of computer architecture. I don't know if you perceive this, but I've taught you stack and heap. The 496T exercise actually taught you how physical hardware performs bitwise operations. And it also taught you the sort of prefix notation that is used by the assembler. And I've taught you an ungodly amount of information theory by accident over time because we've talked about bits nonstop for 14 weeks, right? So I haven't given you any formal training in either of those 2 things, but if you ever take a class in them, you'll understand it. So that's what I think we did this term. I hope you had fun. On the course evals, this class is not planned to ever be taught ever again, certainly in the MSCS. I will probably teach it again in a couple years to the undergrads, and we'll see what happens to them in between now and then. So useful feedback for the dean who reads the evals is whether you think a class like this should be taught, because we have to shift gears if it needs to stay. And then if you particularly like my teaching style for a specific type of course, that would be another good thing to let him know. Like if you would really like to have me cover one of the other courses you've taught, or even just like think it would be a good fit, you should let him know that as well. I'm not slated to teach evenings next year, which doesn't really affect anything, but that means that the next population that comes through this cohort won't see this class or me. So if you have any thoughts on that, you should let me know. I will also read the course evals. The takeaways I have already is that it seems like labs were a huge dud, which is surprising given education literature and not surprising given what I think. So you sort of just confirmed what I think there. I'd be interested in some thoughts on what you think of the difficulties of the homework, the comparative difficulties of the homework. And as you comment on the homeworks, if you spent more than 10 hours on them and did not complete them, I would like to know that as well. I think that's all I have. Thank you so much, and come talk to me if you have any questions. And I think we're done, right? Yes, go home. Thank you.